to get enough informal presentation with enough little details to help all of us in the room that are just such amazing data geeks. And so our first talk will be from the Migration Mavericks, and I'll let them introduce themselves. Yes, give them a hand. They'll have 15 minutes, and then we'll have Q&A for 50 minutes. Yeah. Okay, take it away.
Did one of us come over there, Maddie?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Well, introduce yourself then.
Okay, I'm Ethan Sheridan. On Migration Mavericks. Our team name is because we're trying to do something new for estimating migration, different than looking at surveys or other things. To trying to take some inspiration from different studies of human mobility and see if those have insights which are useful in the case of post-wildfire displaced population. And I am at Portland State University, Population Research Center.
And I'm Mary Angelica Painter, and I'm at the Natural Hazard Center. And we are also collaborating with Samir, who's sitting out, so putting it on us. So we wanted to answer some of the questions that were posted in the Jupyter notebook, and some of them stuck out to us, so we answered some of those. First was what excited us about this week. First was the potential collaborations and connections. Ethan and I are part of a team that was hodgepodge put together maybe like a month and a half before this. So, and we've already had like, it was destiny because now I have like 3 papers planned or something. And also meeting you all. It's been so great to see some familiar faces and meet some new ones. And that's been so wonderful. And also connecting in person. There's not anything like a NOAA workshop to bring everybody together. So yeah, thanks Noah. Also, this has been a space for new interdisciplinary learning. So I am not a demographer. This is the first time I've ever interacted with migration and the first time I've ever studied wildfires extensively. And so like, I think the expertise coming from Ethan's demography, human geography from Samir, and I'm a political scientist, so focusing on like government policy has been really exceptional for bridging together that interdisciplinary work. Also discussing data and data integration. I love talking about data. I love talking about integration, open, reuse, all that stuff. So that's been great. And also just having an intention focused period time to work on projects. Sometimes Ethan, I think, has been wanting to get this particular project going for some time now. And just having the space to like get a plan and get it going and even start doing data integration and answering some of those questions and having wonderful people to help us along the way. So what we're trying to do, some applied contributions from this particular workshop is we aim to understand migration flows after wildfires, because we really want to understand population risks, especially those related to things like physical harm, mental health harm, and public health, and how governmental agencies and also local organizations can support these populations by understanding where they're going to go post wildfires. But there's some major gaps in the research and in practice. There is a dearth of scholarship on wildfire-induced migration within the United States, due in part to the relatively lower historical frequencies of these events. So we see a lot more studies around things like hurricanes, tornadoes, and more active types of hazards. And they also usually take place far from population centers. And there's also just limited data availability as well. Studies concerning the socio-demographic environmental factors and affecting migration decision-making exist, but less research quantifies and spatializes these flows of most people post-wildfires events. So looking at some of the literature, there's often like post-surveys, a lot of behavioral and risk perception analysis, but this actual like quantification of flows from origin places to destinations post-wildfire is understudied. There's also mixed evidence to which degree wildfires actually affect migration. So either in migration or out migration as well. And again, we're using the term migration, but we also understand that some of these people are displaced and migration is forced. So I'm sure demographers have thoughts about the definitions of displacement and migration, which we would love to hear about those. Other limitations with existing studies is migration decisions are often very complex and multidimensional. So how can we actually link how we understand migration to those hazards, because there's many reasons why people will move, not return, or have some other choice in life decisions on where they live. And there's also this ecological analysis versus individual scale. So how can we like be generalized versus like understanding like individual decision choices? Is that correct? Did I get the ecological? Okay, I'm not an ecologist, so I'm gonna make sure I just
Yeah,
heard that wrong.
yeah, I think just the idea being that, usually we studied like a change, a level change, we just measured migration from the same geography and look for a level change, associate that with the disaster. But in this case, we're, having a goal to actually look at person level so we can clearly identify, people who were personally impacted. Yeah.
Thanks, yeah. And the last part is more in like my wheelhouse is those concrete recommendations for local and regional governments that can support those migrating as a result of wildfire impacts. I don't want to be a person who just studies where the policy recommendations get tacked on the end after a methodological analysis or discussion. So I really want to put that problems focused, solution orientated, converge language up front. So I think that we should concentrate on some of these like framing the policy, doing the analysis, then understanding how those recommendations will be used in applied practice.
And I think the cool thing about this in terms of the policy applications is that, not only could it be used in disaster response, before you have information about where people decided to relocate, but it could actually be used in anticipation too. So one of the projects, I guess, on a future slide is thinking about if we know wildfire risks are very high in certain places that are populated, or we can actually maybe anticipate in advance where, if there was a disaster, that people might go to and use that to better target resources. And
especially if there's particular towns or localities that are in the proximity that tend to get high migration flows because of these events. Like how can, anything from federal grants, from, federal agencies to local support and state support can help prepare those localities for those migration flows based on that like hazard risk and migration, what we would call a simulated migration. I don't like to use the word predictive. I'm a political scientist and that's a no-no. So we're going to say simulated understanding of those migration flows. So just reiterating what I just said. So we envision a simulated model for migration flows that can help decision makers locate places to likely be impacted by wildfire displacement, showcasing where capacity gaps exist and additional assistance is needed. So not every place has a up-to-date and robust hazard mitigation or hazard response plan in place. And some localities just don't have capacity either by staff, resources, technological knowledge, or access to other types of funding or resources to be able to actually mitigate for wildfires, but also be able to intake some of these migration flows. So how can we understand those differences in capacity and how can that help us with planning for wildfire? And you're going to take over.
Okay.
You can stay seated.
That's all right. I'll switch off. Yeah.
Okay. Hey, I'll get my coffee.
So there's a lot of info here. We just kind of did an inventory of all the data we had. As Mary Angelica and Samir can attest, we had a huge whiteboard where we tried to flow everything from what we're doing with all of our input data sets, which range from things like local characteristics about the place that's fire affected, as well as I should say the destinations where we find people are relocating to, and comparing those characteristics is one of our objectives. Then also data about the event, right now limited to assessments, so at the address point level of every structure within the fire perimeter, to what extent it was affected, everything from, just minor touch, maybe smoke damage, to completely destroyed, nothing left. And then perimeters that tell us what the extent was, so we can compare the damage assessments to residential parcel data and other data sources about the housing people who live there inside. Then just another kind of like one of the linking things we're using are centroids for some of the geographies, so we can link, turn polygons sometimes into points. And then migration flows. So we have a bit of a kind of a goal of doing a horse race and a validation exercise. The idea is to say, if we had used information on migration flows that are evident in the survey data for these places, where might we assume people who were displaced by this disaster would relocate? And so we have a couple alternatives there. We have the American Community Survey, a large representative sample, which includes both microdata about relocations as well as published county-to-county flows. The IRS statistics of income program includes what are tax migrants, so people who file a tax return in one address one year and another address the next year will be tagged as a migrant. Those flows are aggregated and then published by maybe we'll do that tomorrow, huh? Can I say, yeah, do that after the presentation. Yeah, so we have those public data flows, and then there's another data set which we thought about looking at, which is commuting data set. So we know from this linked longitudinal employer household dynamics program, they will do something where they'll link individuals' residences with their place of work. So I think they do that by social security numbers, and companies that pay into state unemployment insurance programs provide that information, and then people get linked. There are some caveats to that, which those of you who work with this may know. For example, that this is the address of the employer may be in not an establishment level address, and maybe like corporate headquarters. So you get some people who commute daily from like Texas to Boston or something like that. So we know that's probably telecommuting, and we're limiting ourselves to pre-COVID fires partly for that reason. And you have come up with some rules on how to filter that. But still, I think maybe people went to be close to their work. They lost their home and they think, I don't want to lose my job too. So maybe they relocated somewhere closer to work. And then the two real contributions that we're hoping to make are from these blue validation data sets, where the first is called integrated parcel data. This is where we're trying to find information about who lived at each address inside of the fire zone. And then with that information, run it through the Postal Service address change service. So if you have a name and address, you can find out from the Postal Service if there was mail forwarding activated for that address, and what the follow-up address is, and the date that it was implemented, and so on, and whether it was an individual or a family who moved. And so that was the first thing we started out with, but as we worked on it, we realized there are some really significant limitations to the kind of validation we can do with this, namely because of that requirement that we have a name. And the only names we can get from public data are the landowners, the parcel owners. So in some of the fires we looked at, we're really interested in what happened to people who are in mobile home parks. Where did they go? But they're not the ones whose names on the property. So they may be renting a pad and living on it. So we could only look at generally single family homes that were owned by an individual, not a corporation, that kind of thing. And so been on the search for a long time for something that could be a better validation data set, where we're going to try some other things besides these standard migration flows, looking at some parametric migration models, which we'll talk about in the next slide. But we really want, since we're trying new models, to be able to validate them. And so a few years back, some of the people in this room, I think, were on this paper by Jack Ward, showing consumer credit panel could be used to study migration flows. And actually, there was like a call to action at the end of that paper saying, people should really use this to study disasters and wildfires and things like that, because we're in the process of getting approval to use that data. I think it's just a matter of time until we have that. And so we're developing plans for what we want to do with it. But what it is, for those of you who haven't heard of it, is it is an extract of individuals who have credit files with one of the major credit bureaus, I think Experian. So they will keep a record for those who have credit cards and bank accounts or so on. They'll keep a record of every address that this person has ever lived at. You may have gotten a challenge question signing up for a new credit card, like, which one of these addresses have you lived at?
You have 2 minutes.
Oh,
So I
wow.
need you to speak
Okay.
up.
All right, so that's what that is. Yeah. So this is like just a little reproduction of part of that whiteboarding exercise we did, where we kind of mapped all of our data sets to the analysis tasks that they were associated with. So the first one is pretty straightforward. We're just trying to look at what kind of housing and population numbers were inside the fire zone. The second thing, though, that we're doing is trying some models that haven't really been applied, except in like evacuation settings. So the gravity and radiation models are two kind of very simple parametric models of migration that can be implemented without any information about past migration flows, but just things like the size of the population at every potential destination, its distance from the point of origin.
Yeah, what's your rate of analysis?
Just quickly.
Trying to look at individuals, yeah.
So is the time series professional data set or what is it?
The,
Temporal unit.
okay, the frequency of observation. So for the validation data sets, we observe them only in 2 time points. We can reconstruct that into like one of the things we're talking about is what geometry the data set should take. We have the data point, the time at which that they made a move, if they made a move. And so we could convert that into like a person month observation. I think it's updated monthly. And then I think for the consumer credit panel, it's quarterly. So we observe them every quarter since, you know, we can pick an event and then watch every quarter since that event. So we can get something like 400 million observations, person level observations for an event like the campfire. Well, not all those people will have been affected by the campfire, but that's how many we'll have during, say, a 5-year period following the campfire. Right, so we'll generate a set of predictions from these simple models. We'll generate a set of predictions from the, you know, counterfactual, saying if people behaved according to the way that these other data sets say they might have behaved, compared to validation data sets, and then kind of find out which models do well, if there are some things we can learn about making the models do better, and then in phase 2, apply those to that other second paper project where we want to look at what are places we think that could be receiving a lot of displaced people, what is their institutional capacity like, and what are some, you know, actions that could be taken to improve resilience. So yeah, we incorporate that word trustworthy, which is a big focus of our work yesterday. So I think we want to try and come up with a model that we think will be trustworthy. That's a new objective we got from this conference. Temporal granularity. So we observe people in the consumer credit panel data, at least we observe them, so we can observe multiple moves and maybe address one of these scale questions, you know, so where people get immediately displaced right after the disaster, do they just stay there? Or is that an intermediate location? How long do they decide to stay there before they move on to somewhere else, maybe? Yeah, and then actually, once we have the consumer credit panel, we can also look at every disaster. So California is quite disaster prone, you know, we can look at a lot of them that are there. Our extract is for California, but we can also maybe look at other ones. Yeah, so we got a lot done this week. And we're still working on some of the data acquisition, integration, and processing, but we've got some progress there. And yeah, just sharing some new knowledge. This is the first kind of hot off the presses, you know, things we can look at, like we had looked at, or I looked at this disaster in a previous paper, but this finding is new. So from Campfire, this is processed this week at least from the change of address data. So from our kind of not ideal, but current validation data set. And so we find things like really, really short moves. This is a fire that happened in an affluent area, and as you can tell, just destroyed a, you know, significant, but not all of the housing in that area was destroyed. Short moves, people seem to have stayed in the vicinity, close to where they lived. When I looked at that, you know, school enrollments, actually, we found out that most people kept their kids in the same school that they attended before, so we think they didn't move too far. Whereas for the campfire, almost all the housing there was destroyed, and the median distance was quite a bit further. Yeah, this is kind of thing we can maybe, you know, start to do. So we have I guess the colors got inverted. So in the red model is kind of a parametric migration model prediction for where folks would end up, given that they were going to move. And then the blue is the change of address data for where they actually moved. And so our goal is to get the red to look more like the blue in that graph. Yeah, and then like Angelica alluded to, we have kind of a couple different goals, things we can do with this. We would really like to, one of the things that emerged from our discussions was to actually make this data accessible to other people in an aggregated form. It's quite difficult to get access to the consumer credit panel. If we can kind of get approval to publish some aggregated data on flows from post certain disasters, maybe open that up and enable other folks to build off of it.
I think we could start Q&A. We just put some questions up here. Yeah.
Awesome. Great job. Exciting. I mean, Ann and I were both chatting with each other about next steps, and I'm excited, appreciative we are, and how hard you work, and no small task.
Yeah.
Floor's open.
Yeah, and any feedback, we're much earlier, I think, in our project than some of the other teams because of our newness, but so if anybody has anything like right out the gate that should be considered, always appreciate that.
Yes, I have a question. We've asked about the vulnerable populations in particular,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm sure, given the constitution of this group, you've thought about that. Could you say something more about how that came into your discussions this week?
Yeah, and so we kind of split up our projects in the style of like papers, because we're academics, so that's how we think. And so the first one is really focused on like trying to understand this simulated understanding of like where people might end up. And the second one is, I don't know if you saw like the number 4 about like hazards and local capacity. So some other research I've done has looked at things like federal vulnerability maps, and stuff that incorporate things like social vulnerability and how they don't map onto things like actual like capacity of like governments to be able to like address things like social vulnerability. And so part of the second paper, and something I'm still kind of mulling over, is like how to incorporate and understand social vulnerability in the context of this like migration flows. And so from the government and policy side, I think we have a pretty clear understanding that we want to look at, okay, are people going from places that like have high government capacity and maybe have a very updated like local hazard mitigation plan, and then are getting displaced or migrating to places that don't have as much capacity in terms of like resources, staffing, or places that maybe have expired plans or have never even had a local hazard mitigation plan. And so like, are they increasing their risk for moving one place to the other? But I'm also wanting to incorporate some statistical understandings of social vulnerability, which I think is difficult for 2 ways, because I don't know if it's looking at the actual populations that are moving or moving from one place to the other, because things like social vulnerability indices look at identifier characteristics rather than place or system characteristics. And also because of that, anybody who knows me and knows my work is that I have a huge chip on my shoulder about social vulnerability indices, and my entire career is taking it down. So and critiquing it. So like even using an SVI or something like that to understand the effects of these populations is like, I'm still kind of like, I'm trying to think through so people have ideas on that too. And like also trying to find a way to account for people who live in like manufactured housing or mobile home parks as well, because of that ownership of the land and like the documentation on who owns it. Like, how are we actually capturing those vulnerable populations from moving to one place to the other? And even if you have one significant indicator, it usually correlates with all of these other like things that we understand to be part of vulnerability.
Yeah, I would agree on that. Like, I think renters versus owners is one thing we want to look at, you know, in terms of like people get displaced further, you know, if they're renters, it's harder for them to find a follow-up place. I think that's something that is really suggestive, and I want to dig into further about, you know, why it was there was such little migration displacement in Santa Rosa. It's like a more affluent area. It's been rebuilt. A lot of the same owners still have maintained their land, which has not been the case. There's definitely, you know, policies that come into play in terms of what does the recovery planning look like? Is there any intention to bring people back? Or, you know, is there actually an intention to like not have RV parks return? They want to turn this into, you know, more of a resort community, that kind of thing. So there's a lot of kind of policy questions on what happens in recovery that we can get into as well.
Yeah.
Thank you. Super impressive.
Yeah. Can I just add like one more thing? Another thing we're working on with our other colleague who had to like unfortunately have me get this because we're trying to framework a concept about like hazard gentrification, because we kind of understand this like return in the context of like other hazards. So the big example that always sticks out in my mind, because I work in Colorado, is the 2013 floods and beyond, where, you know, disabled poor populations were displaced from the area, and now you would be able to get affordable housing there for time in memoriam, and now like a house is like $2 million in that same place. And if you drive through it, they're like, everybody owns stuff. It's almost Stepford Wives, actually, if you're ever there. It's very like idyllic and like high income, and like they've built single affordable housing, but it's still almost $2,000 a month. And if you've ever been poor, that's not affordable. So so we kind of see the same like pattern with like other hazards and other historical understandings. And so like, how do we incorporate that with like something like acutely like fire?
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah. All right, question here and then John.
Yeah, it's been very impressive, so congratulations. I was just curious about the theory behind, because I would agree with fire to put them, they get real awareness fires. But they can also appear in urban areas, etc. But mostly real areas, forested areas, etc. So I was wondering, so what's the demographic of people living here? people working in rural areas, also older people probably. So what type of migration are you looking at? So I was curious about some of that.
Yeah, I think it's mixed. So actually one of the interesting things about the wildland urban interface is that, and that's maybe, unique to Western states, but it's where there's a lot of affordable housing being built, because in a lot of developed areas, it's quite difficult to develop, to build infill housing, to densify, to build new housing on whatever land is still available there. So a lot of construction and new housing developments are put out in areas that have very, very high wildfire risk, and so the population is growing there. And I'd say that, it tends to be like middle class housing, actually. Now there are some exceptions to that. It is kind of case by case. So like if you look at like fires in Southern California that have kind of reached some like vacation homes and stuff like that, but often then those don't displace any people because they weren't occupied at the time, or really few people who live there. And I think what's unique about the two fires we looked at here, that they really did hit, they weren't just, out in the woods like most of the fires are, and why fires have been kind of maybe understudied in terms of population displacement, because many fires don't displace many people. These are two exceptions where they really did hit urban areas, dense urban areas. And, we think that it's likely to happen more often, both as a combination of increased fire risk everywhere, but then also because of the increased housing construction in the wild and urban interface.
Joan, last question.
No pressure. Okay. Super cool. I'll be looking forward to seeing you guys come out with this, but I'm thinking about the selection into who is updating their address and what that means. And especially as you're mentioning like social vulnerability, is this differential by income level or immigration status? Or I'm just thinking about like, who are you actually going to be tracking? And it seems like it's a specific subset of people, but I also don't know, like, are you able to kind of characterize who, they probably are, because you know which house they lived in and where they moved. So kind of the socioeconomic status of these people and then who you might be missing with this method.
Yeah, do you wanna?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think why it's been so slow moving, because it's just really not satisfying to work only from the change of address data. We really want consumer credit panel, because even for all of its lack of representation, I think like only maybe 4 out of 5 or 9, I forget, it's 80 or 90% of people have a credit file about them. They have enough activity that they have that file. That's still a significant number of people, and maybe disproportionately high in like mobile home parks and places where we want to see where there were outcomes like that. The one nice thing about the consumer credit panel versus, so the change of address, obviously, you have to file that, and we're not confident that because only 40% of people, actually both pretty consistent, only 40% of people filed that change of address. Not really sure if that means they didn't move or they just didn't bother. They're like, I only got junk mail there, I don't care, and start over fresh. Yeah. But I think with the consumer credit panel, it doesn't rely on you to update your address. Companies update it on your behalf, companies that want to connect with you because you owe them money somehow. So there's some kind of methodology on that. I think that they say they kind of have weighted voices. They look at different addresses that are on file with different agencies, financiers you interact with. And they kind of go to like the consensus, or they like look at important voices, I guess, to whom you give the most money or who they know gives more reliable updates. And so, there's some things that are written on that. I would, really encourage you to look at the Jack DeWard et al. Paper for discussion on that. Really good one in demographic research.
Yeah, and just to add really quick, like this is the point of, this is where like qualitative data comes in, right? And so like going out and actually having conversations with people, it's to start this like understanding of like mapping and understanding where people are going, and then becomes like the real proof, like the real like digging into like going on the ground, talking to people, interviewing, that sort of thing, and really, I guess, using the social science definition of ground truthing to like go and talk to people about that.
But it's been really hard to get this socioeconomic data sometimes, because one of the things we discovered in the course of doing this, you try to geocode an address for a house that's demolished and you get no results. So we have to go back and having to use older Tiger Line data from before the fire to do the geocoding. And so there's like complexities there, and then try to tap the socioeconomic characteristics based on the geocoded point. Yeah.
Yeah, oh my God. Yeah, no, thank you.
So
That was
thanks,
your
you guys. We had a chat question, and I'm just gonna ask it, but you don't need to answer it. In what way, if any, is data about homeowners insurance cost availability being brought into this model? Different state insurance regulatory and rate environments may be a key missing factor here.
Yeah,
That's
we
what
know.
Sam Sellers, who's a demographer, does environmental demography in.
Awesome.
In the private
Yes,
sector.
thank you.
Uh-huh. Okay. Okay, next. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, we'll try to get the transitions, going faster next time. Great, thank you.
Should we still end by 10?
Yeah, I know, I don't worry.
Okay.
Okay, Dick, let's,
No, we still have 30 minutes.
okay, okay. All right, take it away, guys. I'll do the movie for you, I think, 'cause
I can handle it.
okay, but I have to.
Okay,
keep
better.
track of some of the chat. Okay,
Okay, sorry.
that's right.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. This is Columbia Hurricane Migration Team. Just a quick reminder how we come about. We're all based on the London campus at Columbia. I'm a political scientist, work mostly on migration to Sahara. Kit is a GIS specialist working at Citizen with me. Andrew is a weather specialist, who has a lot of experience working with the Red Cross, and Mona is our climate expert. He should just start a new job now in this industry.
Mona-san.
Yeah, Mona is, yeah, she's joining now, so. Yeah, so we were all living, we were all on the same campus, and we wanted to do something together, mostly focusing how we can better use some of the hurricane data that Mona has been working with to look at migration in this context. So we came up with this workshop with, I think, 3 overarching research questions. So to what extent hurricane impact models, so very fine grained projection in terms of impact and different physical manifestation of hurricanes can help predict migration immobility. I think these are related questions and they can happen at different scales. And to what extent an indicator of socioeconomic status might interact with this impact and give rise to either immobility or migration. So that was these 2 top questions in terms of more theoretical scientific understanding. And we wanted also to understand to what extent can a predictive model of migration be leveraged for policy development and early warning, and if so, what would such a model, what would be the shape of such a model? In terms of objective, so we wanted to build such predictive model of migration, looking at specifically here at hurricane wind gust and evaluate its fit and how useful it can be. Validate this model against external data sources and collect feedback from you all here, and understanding how such a model might support decision makers. Very quick overview of our progress and how we got, I think, how we assess our work so far. We built an initial predictive model of migration. I call it initial. It's really a term model. I would not really use it for any purposes. I think it misses a lot of things, but we were able to set up this model, thanks in part to JSON assistance. And I think we got a lot of feedback about what are the type of data we can use. One of some of the challenge working in a US context with migration data. But I'm not sure we're really yet there now. I think there's a lot we want to do from a model building perspective, and I think the feedback we received this week are very useful for us as we go forward. And something I think we're missing actually 1 day for this. To be fair, is that we had a very long, actually started the whole afternoon on Tuesday afternoon discussion about how can such a model be useful from a policy perspective. What would be the shape of such model? I don't think we cracked the nut yet here. I think one model would be useful to come back to the model and look at how this could have been useful, but we're certainly hoping to move forward in the next few weeks on that regard. So just a few things first about the model, and then Andrew and Kit will talk a bit more about our overall experience here and some of the insight we can get from how such model could be used from a policy perspective. But I just want to give a few words about the model itself. So what we wanted to do with this model is use data, very fine-grained track level data on both physical manifestation and impact of hurricanes. For the batch 2001 to 2021, this is data that Mona generated from the HAZUS model, and it we can do two things. So what's really nice about this data is that you're able to model those physical manifestation and model impacts. Most of the data we have are reported losses, which comes with a lot of bias. So there's a lot of things we don't see, and this model could potentially, but we don't know, potentially be useful in terms of getting a better sense of the damage that is caused by hurricanes. And it's very high resolution that, and so we were hoping to look both at wind gusts and storm surge. Turns out storm surge it's much longer to run the model and get the prediction. So we leave those out. We're just looking in at storms, at wind gusts and wind gust impact in terms of residential damages and employment losses. And while looking at those two dimensions specifically, I think from a theoretical standpoint, it's interesting to try to disaggregate a bit the impact of hurricanes, right? If it's residential loss, it's not the same causal pathway than if it's probably more employment losses, right? If you leave your if you have direct damage that you've suffered from a hurricane, you may be incentivized to move, but it's not clear that you will move very far actually. You may want to move in the same municipality a bit further away. If it's more damages to the economic opportunities you have in a given area, you may actually be incentivized to move much further away. So I think, or maybe end up immobile conversely. So I think like trying to pick and like disaggregate the causal pathway is very important. And so we built a model using this data and some area data on migration. Of course, the data comes with a lot of limitation. I'm happy to discuss this further. But yeah, that's our overarching framework. And we brought in some data on social vulnerability writ large. I think that's a question about what dimension we may want to focus. On the one hand, we have a model looking at poverty, rate, median income, share of ownership at the county level, etc. But we also use some social vulnerability composite indicators that we have here at ZDAC at Lamont. And I think the overall idea would be from such a model, if we were to fit one convincing model, then to do projection. We are very fortunate to have at Columbia, this Columbia CHAZ, future prediction of hurricanes over about 50 to 100 years interval. And it's a track simulation process where we can use potentially this to then model impact again and get back to predictive model of such damage and how this could influence migration in the future. Assuming we would ever go have like a convincing model, of course. And so I mentioned already, so we're focusing only on category 3 hurricane here. I think again, it's quite consuming just to generate this projection from 2002 to 2021. And we're looking here only at wind-related losses for now. We aim to look at storm surge, which is much more impactful, but it takes much more time to generate those. So we have to make some decision on what to focus at this point. And yeah, we're looking at the wind footprint directly, residential losses and employment losses. We also have data losses, but we didn't use it for now. That's our list of disaster. It's about, I think, for some reason we are actually only 11 here in our model, but I'm happy to come back on this term. I just wanna, for the sake of time, move a little bit further. So we're looking at, I mentioned we're looking for a physical manifestation of hurricane. So this is for Katrina specifically. This is simulated wind speed based on the tracks of the hurricane at 3 seconds gust. And wind gust actually very important from a physical perspective because that's really what's driving the damage due to wind. It's not sustained wind, it's wind gust. So we also have sustained wind, but we're mostly focusing on wind gust. And these are in miles per hour, and you can really see the center and the area of high winds from Katrina. That's the same now for residential damage. So that's model damage, of course. So there's a question about potential bias error in the data. And this is residential damage in thousands of dollars on the log scale, just to be wary of this. So that's how our data. From such data, we actually built cross-sectional time series data set over 20 years for the set of states that are bordering the Gulf, so Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Florida, and within all the country within 250 kilometers from the coast. If you're beyond that, it's a scoping condition we don't consider. We're looking at net migration at the county level, right? from the RS data, and we have two different set of models. One model just look at physical impact directly. So we have two variables. I mentioned already the wind gust, so 3-second maximum wind gust speed, and the average sustained, the maximum sustained wind speed, which is the 1 minute, average, but it's also generally less impactful. And then we also have this impact model specifically looking at residual loss in carbon dollar and employment loss also expressed in dollars. We have a series of socioeconomic indicators. I already mentioned we have two such models, one with a set of derived measure of socioeconomic status and one with composite indicators. And to that we had population share, population, low elevation zones, etc. I mentioned unit of analysis county year, right? And we use, that was something we wanted to try something. I'm mostly used to work in econometric / Bayesian modeling, but we wanted to try something new. So we apply a machine learning model to this setup. So we consider different model, one of price boosting neural nets, and I'm gonna just move the small window here. Sorry. And turns out the best model we came across is the boosting model. It has a relatively high R-square, but of course, anyone having worked in the past with cross-sectional time series data will know that these are not random independent observation. There's a lot of structure in our data, and you would expect from just having those variables that we measure time invariant at the county level to have a high R-square. And in fact, that's why we see here, when you look at the importance of those variables, most of our model currently is being driven by the population 2000, the share of real population in the county in 2000, poverty level in 2000. So on the other hand, those wind gusts and sustained wind damage, they are very little explanatory powers so far. In a way, you would expect this from the literature, right? The climate effects are generally much lower, much more moderate, and when we know than what is actually taught in the media. But still, I mean, it was still a bit even weaker than I thought. And I would even argue that the difference between wind gust and sustained wind is not really discernible here. So I think very little power. Now that's a very initial set, it's really for model in that sense. So I think there's a lot we can do from here. But so far, I think there's only limited utility for such model. Maybe one thing we also try in neural net, turns out the neural net perform much worse. So I think there's also a reason to try different models. I think that's what I think from this. So, and
Yeah, 3 minutes.
Move quick. Okay, so we'll go through these quick. What challenges did you encounter? So I think some of these are more common amongst the groups that we spoke with, positive data mismatch of scale. Some of these are maybe specific to us, I'm not sure, but I think one of the core themes, for me at least, that's coming out this week is around the concept or term of intention. You know, it's not necessarily something as a physical scientist we prioritize, but I mean, yeah, like what is it, how privileged is it to claim that what we're doing has any sort of impact in the real world or on policy? I mean, we thought a lot about that today. And I think as Fabienne said, like we're definitely presenting this as a toy model, but what is the difference between, like, maybe our results are not sufficient to justify influencing policy decisions, but then what would that threshold be when we're talking about appropriateness or sufficient? How do we even gauge that? And even if we do think there's some value to policy or real world decision-making, to what extent do we have any confidence that we're actually helping the most vulnerable populations? You know, bigger picture, more course, we could have benefit, but the disproportionate impact on the most vulnerable, are we actually making that worse? It kind of summarizes this slide, as I know we need to keep moving. But it is something I've been very inspired from our discussions this week. I mean, we're still adjacent to this, to some of this community, and it's been really helpful to have some challenging discussions around this. Insights of the work. Yeah, so I think I'll skip over this just because we have 2 more minutes, but this a lot just builds up what we were saying around if and to what extent a specific hurricane that is forecast to have socioeconomic impact may lead to migration. So, I mean, statements that we could say the different timescales at which statements can be made. about the different types of impacts from hurricanes and potential migration. Bigger picture, we thought a lot about the multi-hazard aspects of hurricanes. Like as Fabian said, we focused on the wind element because that's what we had the data processed for. But yeah, certainly we know that hurricanes are inherently a multi-hazard event. And the spatial temporal distribution of the subhazards will differ from storm to storm, sometimes significantly. Like when we see this, I mean, there's other implications related to climate change as well, in terms of weather, hurricanes, and different sorts of hydrometeorological hazards, perhaps being at, or let's say occurring at a higher magnitude, higher duration, these sorts of things. So one of our next steps is challenging ourselves to think more about that. There is a growing community on compound events, compound risk assessment. To what extent can we approach some of our research and some of our policy discussions around that? Hydrometeorological events, even tornadic activity associated with tropical cyclones are key aspects that should be included in our next steps. Let's pass it over to Kit for 2 minutes, 1 minute,
Yep.
30 seconds.
You got it.
30 seconds.
Well, we're really excited to apply AI and ML. And, you know, as you can see in this image from ChatGPT about our Columbia hurricane migration team, it does, you know, it's amazing what AI and ML can do, but of course we see that migration is very orderly here. It's very orderly. And it's not quite Columbia, it's Columba, so it's close. But not exactly what we're looking for. So, you know, we need to look at these new techniques with a careful eye. But certainly for us and our team this week is very exciting to apply these. So what do we need to keep this work going? You know, we need opportunities like this to talk with the community and identify and describe, integrate user needs and perceptions. We need the space, like was provided here this week, to discuss these issues and to ask challenging questions. You know, this is the monkey in the room, right? We need funding in order to do this work. But the third item I have is open science. I just want to make a quick 20-second pitch on this, is that, you know, one thing within NASA is that Transform the Open Science mission. You know, we're trying to accelerate scientific discoveries with all these data behind paywalls. You know, the old world where we protected our methods, it's changing. The Nelson memo is changing that if we're taking any funding from federal agencies. And, you know, it's a hard change, like pulling teeth sometime, but it's something that ultimately it's going to broaden participation. We're going to get more diverse views. We're going to accelerate our discoveries by doing this. So I won't spend much time on this, but, you know, there's good evidence that open science produces research that has more citations. Bigger impacts, increases transparency and more inclusiveness. You know, the populations we're targeting, if they're not telling us what their problems are, we're making a leap in assuming that we know what their problems are. And we may build systems that look good from a theoretical standpoint, but at the end of the day, if they're not used, like, are we wasting our time or not? Open science is inclusive, so let's collaborate. And, you know, thanks again for providing the space to do that. So I'll just appeal to you guys, if you don't know about this already, to check out openscience101.org. NASA's put together a framework for learning how to do open science. It's hard for us. We don't have the resources. Open science is expensive. It wasn't written into my last grant. But I think the funding agencies, they're understanding that we're gonna need to budget for this stuff. So Open Science 101 teaches us how to do those management plans and how to, if you want to apply for NASA Roses grants in the future, you need to do this. My last point is that, you know, I mentioned co-production. You know, I came into this week thinking that we were going to talk a lot more about decision support systems. And, you know, we talked a lot about modeling, which is super important. But I think, you know, when we get to the point of where the rubber meets the road, we need to think about things like, what are the systems architectures here? We had this great architecture from NCAR this week, which is awesome. How do we roll that out and train people in communities so that they can access and use those things? open science and knowledge transfer allows for that. This image is about air quality. It's what I had in pocket, but you could imagine something about disasters and migrations. That's quite a similar workflow. So too much time. We're excited about many things. It's for the record here. We'll share all these slides. I just want to thank the floaters, for helping move us along here and your 2020 vision of what's possible. We were joking about how, you see these floaters in front of you. Not everyone maybe can see it, but it's there, and that's what you guys showed us is what's possible. So thanks very much.
Okay, I'm just gonna stop share so we can see Mona. And, let's see if we have any chat here. Okay. Yes, Andrea.
You mentioned that you are planning to look at storm surge as well. Are there any plans to look at inland flooding? Because I would imagine, especially if you're talking about wind, what really damages properties is when a roof rips off and then it rains a bunch in it, right? And so I'm wondering if there's any other, I don't know much about chat, so I'm just curious if there's also like an inland, at least precipitation or anything.
So I can chime in here. First of all, I just wanted to appreciate you for this opportunity. So about that question, I think the first step is considering the wind damages. The second step would be surge, and the third step would be precipitation, which is we can combine it with storm surge and make it a compound flood model. So for sure, this is within our list for the next step of this process and project. And that's very important to understand, especially for this low-lying area along the Gulf of Mexico is more susceptible to compound flooding. So this is something that we are thinking about how we can consider within the next step. Thank you for your question.
Another, yes, John.
Could you speak a little bit more about the migration data? Maybe I missed it. I mean, you said observational data, but that is not clear about what that is. So, what we're looking at, point A to point B, distances, so we'll
Yeah.
a little bit more about it.
So-
And how it's played.
Yeah, it's the RS country to country migration data, but we're only looking at out migration. So we for this application, the very initial application, we decided not to look at destination because destination adds a lot of complexity around it. Especially when you have a time series like gravity modeling has shown, actually pretty much many of our books have been shown to be very bad at temporal modeling. I think we wanted to keep everything a bit more simple in that sense. At least initially. So it's just outflow. Like in that case, net out migration, right? Are there more people? And net migration, there is more people coming in, leaving. That sense.
But it would be a year
Yeah.
IRS.
Yeah.
because of the IRS data. Yeah. And it was individual tax filings, not business filings, or?
My understanding is individual.
Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah, Masha.
I appreciated your discussion of applications to policymakers and decision makers. Can you imagine how this tool would be used by groups that aren't necessarily policymakers, where this would be useful? So maybe, city planners or homeowners or insurance companies or farmers or anything like that, where, maybe the modeling would be useful and you don't need to get it to the middleman, the policymakers. I mean, the policy obviously is really important, but maybe there could be also direct applications as well.
Yes, I think, this is something that these questions were definitely front of mind, coming into this event. And we were challenging ourselves to ask that question, but even perhaps, maybe not more appropriately, but even get a sense of the misuse of these data too, right? And I feel like that's one of the aspects we could have brought out a little bit more, this week. And I think even in our work, we should. It feels good to talk about the benefits. It feels good to think about people using it, but to what extent is that an incomplete line of thinking, of thought? So, yeah, just wanted to say that before I address your question, but I think it's important, especially if we're talking about the most vulnerable, like even thinking about the group before us. yeah, like we know there's research that shows that the people we claim we're trying to help actually aren't included in our methods. So, and I see this a lot from my work in the international space too, I should say. So I'm learning about these dynamics in the domestic context. But certainly, like we did come up, one of the slides that I skipped through for time, we did think about a couple of potential opportunities for this sort of work to be valuable. Perhaps state level discussions at the beginning of the tropical cyclone season, for example. You know, that's one moment in the US, at least, when we do think about hurricane preparedness, hurricane anticipatory action. To what extent should there be some content, you know, in those discussions related to migration? Not sure, but that's something that we are thinking about. Another aspect I think we should be discussing is more on the risk perception and like cognition side of things. We don't have someone on our team in that space, so I mean, it's more of like an open call for if people are interested in that side of things, and that would be something we're interested in integrating more.
Sure. The only thing I would add to that is that, you know, we did talk a bit on the tool development side of, you know, we're all facing this problem of a lack of data. And, you know, we were just talking about how it's a paradox that on one side within official data, there are all of these walls and privacy protections, which are great. On the other side, people are giving their data away all the time. And, you know, if there were a mechanism that could help our community where people could volunteer their data short of going through a formal official survey, you know, that could solve a lot of problems. Of course, you know, the other benefit then is that when you're rolling out these tools, you're training citizen scientists and educating them about all sorts of different things as well. So, you know, I think that's one way to go direct to the person rather than, you know, B2B as we often go.
Okay, we have one
I'll make it
comment,
quick.
question, yeah.
Well, there's a really interesting slide that you showed. I don't know if we could quickly throw it up, but I think it was around the relative importance of certain variables. I just wanted to make sure that I'm understanding that slide right. If we could,
Yeah.
yeah. Could you maybe just walk us through that slide because it went a little bit quickly? Yeah, this slide, yeah.
So what we see here is how different variables to explain the model, right? On the fit of the model of the tricky. What's interesting is these are time invariant variables. Did not just clear enough. So we didn't want to have those measure of vulnerability we wanted to keep it fixed because we have it at the decennial, maybe more frequently later after 2009 with the ACS. But here we are only at the decennial, we can interpolate, but interpolation itself is problematic unless you do use multiple imputation, which is we have with people work here. So these are time invariant data that measure at the county level, and you can see there's a lot of explanation here. Why is this? Because of course, these are different observation. Like you have always a lot of migration out of
Places that aren't large.
yeah, exactly. And conversely for rural areas, and that we do expect to some extent that they reflect the structure of the data. So that's why the very high R square is misleading in that sense. And these two data, this is what time varying, and we see very little. Again, we could expect this depending on where you come from, right? Environmental impact so far have been very limited. At least that's my experience from the world. But
I mean, the other part of that is that on coastal areas, you have, in these particular coastal places, you have very large cities along those coasts. A lot of growth in those areas. Yeah.
But is the negative, like the fact that the effective found is negative mean that these are associated with less out migration?
no, this cannot be interpreted like this. The model doesn't give you anything. At best, you could say, well, it may like JSON we are better, but it would say that maybe it doesn't for the model. Or can you interpret it?
Is the sensitivity of a certain parameter on the output of the model's prediction?
Well, it's not, if it's permutation, it's not even that, like, depending on which way you're using it, it's usually how much does your verification metric change when you randomize the values across, permute them across your examples. So when you're using these XAI methods, you do have to be careful to know what question they are, because they each ask a slightly different question.
So what does negative mean? And that's how much to change.
That means the error went, basically, if it's negative, it depends on, I guess, what is the metric that you use?
Net migration, it's
Net out migration.
net migration, so you can
Net-
be both positive and negative in that.
Oh.
Okay, what is truth in this case? Like what actually happened or I guess what is when you're fitting the model, did you use like RMSE or MAE or?
RMSE, yeah.
Okay, so I'm assuming this would probably be RMSE then, as the x-axis?
Yeah,
Or
I
change in
don't,
RMSE?
I don't know exactly, yeah,
Jason,
I should
Jason's
double check
here.
the.
We have to see the code to see
Yeah.
exactly the answer to that question, but
Yeah, but we used the exact format you were suggesting.
One more comment, Matt.
Sorry, I have a question for clarification, because you said net migration and net out migration?
No,
So
net,
it's not-
net
Net
migration.
migration, sorry.
My fault.
So is it out or is it net?
Net,
It is net.
in minus out.
Okay, so I would recommend not looking at net migration because
Oh.
you get a confusing signal with disasters.
I also looked at out migration, that's not much different from the picture you have
Are you
here.
looking at it here?
Yeah, but the model was slightly different because we were looking at, log out migration in that case, or maybe it's just also the way we transform the variable. So.
Okay, migration folks, drill in
Very-
during discussion with them. Thank you so much. Next group is the floodsters, and they're making their way from the back of the room forward.
And I also want to thank both the Columbia Hurricane Migration Team and the Floodsters team for frantically switching places this morning. So thank you for being flexible.
Start the clock as soon as you start talking, so you have your real amount of time.
I invite everyone, if you want to stand up for a second and stretch, we do so because it's been an hour, so. It's been so interesting, but I feel like when I was walking here, I was like, oh yeah, I can feel like my ribs.
You guys doing okay? No takers?
Fine, thank you.
Okay. Don't eat into their time too much. It's a good idea to have a stretch, but let's take it away. And you want to?
Thank you. Hi everyone, we're at the Floodsters and we want to present what we've been up to this week. First, we want to start by explaining a little bit the motivation for our research. The project stemmed from the fact that there was a lot of studies trying to understand whether flood management measurements are effective or not. But most of them focus specifically on understanding whether there is any economic effectiveness overall in terms of the savings that a flood management program delivers. And I just wanna give like an example of the motivation behind. So if a decision maker is given two measures that they can use to prevent flooding, and one will save $4 million and the other one will save $1 million, in face value, you would say, I will probably go for the $4 million one. But you may be choosing to save one house versus an entire neighborhood, right? Like this is a simple reasoning, but just to kind of show what is the motivation for us, not only to ask whether flood adaptation programs are effective, but also for who is really benefiting from the different type of measures that we implement. And this question kind of hinges, or it's at this intersection of the importance of understanding disaster preparedness from a decision maker perspective. So how are our measures and our policies affecting population or helping citizens? But also it hinges on the idea that we need to take a step back and think about what are the objectives of the policy. What are we upholding? Are we just focusing on purely saving dollars? Are we focusing on advancing climate justice goals? And just to give an example of some of the findings that we, or some of the evidence that we found in the past that motivated us to keep going. So this, very quickly, this plot here is showing the savings that a given household receives from the implementation of a flood adaptation program. In this case, we're looking at different risk scores or communities with different risk scores. And this is what happens to high-income communities. So you can see that as their flood risk increases, actually they derive more savings. So, you know, the measures are working pretty well. But for low income, measures are working as well. But specifically, they're working in areas where risk is lower. So basically, they are able to maybe implement some low-hanging fruit activities or measures. But when it comes to higher risk, they are actually not seeing as much savings. So, you know, we can see a difference there. And like this, we found many others. Chen will talk a little bit about it later. And we don't only look into income, but also education, race, precipitation, flood risk, as you've seen. And these findings, we're kind of trying to look or to take a step back to think about how flood adaptation measurements have worked historically, but thinking about or reflecting on what will happen with climate change and with increasing evidence that some of the flooding events will become more extreme. Our questions is still in this intersection kept growing. So thinking about whether the measures that we are applying now or that we see that work nowadays will actually work in the future, especially for urban communities most at risk. But also within those urban environments where communities differ so much, which of these communities will actually benefit, which ones will lose out. At the end of the day, we're implementing these measures with tax dollars. So who is really benefiting from this and who is not? And also, will some of the effects of these programs be exacerbated? So will they contribute to increasing, for instance, inequality gaps, or will they help to close these gaps? So this is what we are kind of set to answer. And you know, there's many programs out there for flood adaptation, but the one that we use to measure this is a community rating system. You might be familiar with it, but just very quickly, the community rating system is a FEMA driven program. It was actually started in the 1990s. And thanks to these 3 decades of implementation, it's a rich data set. And the program is actually very thorough in terms of the type of measurements that it includes for flood adaptation or for flood management, including engineering solutions, includes also regulatory solutions, and also improves the level of citizen engagement in the type of implementation. And one thing that might help you understand later how this data can help us understand some of the effectiveness is that the program in itself, it's incentivizes communities to implement these activities. And the way they get incentivized is that they receive savings or they receive discounts in their flood insurance. And in exchange for implementation. And this can create, well, not the savings itself, but the characteristics of programs create a quasi-experimental setup that I just want to explain very quickly with this map. You can see here, control are the communities that are not in the CRS, and 3 of the communities are in the CRS. We could talk about this map for like hours, but just to note that these dots all represent the same outcomes, which is the claims that a household are paid, the insurance claims that are paid after a flooding. And this is what allows us to compare, or this quasi-experiment to exist, where communities that are part of the CRS and communities that are not, both have access to the NFIP insurance program. And
Cool. So as Lydia nicely motivated, our question is trying to assess whether, not just whether flood adaptation is effective, but also from whom. So really asking this like detailed question of for which type of communities is it beneficial for, who's benefiting in all these details. So to answer this specific question, we developed this framework called causal flow. So it's a data-driven causal inference framework that uses normalizing flows, hence the name flow. And let me just briefly explain how that works. So before I begin, I want to explain why it's actually challenging to try to answer these, measure the treatment effect of some policy for a specific population. So let's like take a very, very simple situation here of a one-dimensional outcome and a one-dimensional covariate variable. You can think of the y-axis here as like the flood damages proxied by the flood insurance claims, and the x-axis here is income of the community that's affected, the median income of the household. So this is not real data. Here I'm showing you fake data that I just generated used for this control sample. So these are the communities that are not part of the participating program, part of the CRS program. And here's another fake set of data that I generated for the treated sample. So these are communities that actually participate in the CRS. So in the standard approach, what you would typically do is you would assume some type of functional form for both the median value of the loss and also for the likelihood. You would assume a Gaussian likelihood. And then you would do some type of regression to model the flood damages as a function of income. So I'm showing you an example of what it might look like if you used linear regression, which you should not do. But really, logistic regression, polynomial regression, all of these things, they still assume some functional form. They have these built-in assumptions that may or may not be true, and in most cases is definitively not true. And the real problem with this is that in this hypothetical scenario with linear regression, that will be the estimated effect of the program, the savings of the program for a low-income household. Whereas obviously, if you look at it by eye, the true effect is much larger. So by doing this, we can actually get biased measurements of how effective a program is and for different communities. So what do we do instead? Well, we use causal flow, and the entire premise is that rather than assuming some functional form and some Gaussian likelihood, we actually learn the output distribution from the data at hand. This is an entirely data-driven approach. So our goal is then to estimate the outcome, the flood damages, given the covariate variables, in this example, income. And we do this for the control sample in orange and the treated sample in the blue. And what we use is the normalizing flows, which is a conditional generative model. And you can think of this as sort of the way any generative model works is by estimating the distribution of the data. And I won't go into the math of it, but you can think of it like in this scenario, it would actually learn what the distribution looks like. And so by doing this, we can actually estimate the accurate treatment effect for specific communities. So here's, Lydia gave you some summaries of what we found, but this is the full analysis that we did last year, where the covariates include precipitation, educational attainment, flood risk scores, a number of other variables. And we do this for 27 different types of communities with different income, different population, different racial demographics. And then we look at how the flood loss savings change as a function of different variables like this. So I'm not going to go into the details about this here, but you can, for instance, see that as it rained more, all types of communities benefit from the CRS program, which is really reassuring. So that was the question we aimed to answer earlier. Now, during this hackathon, our main goal was not only for whom, but also in a future where we have climate change. So in the future, how will these programs benefit or hurt different communities? So what we did is we combined the causal flow framework that we developed with the same, trained on the same data sets as before, with the First Street Foundation flood risk measurements and predictions, forecasts for 2052, and the CMIP 6, CMIP, yeah. I'm learning the lingo now. CMIP 6 forecasts that go all the way out to 2100. So here's an example for Houston, Texas. I'm showing you here the flood risk from the First Street Foundations in the grayscale, and this is the precipitation that was measured that we took from the PRISM data set. And then based on, and here's what the projections look like. These are the differences from here. So as things get darker, there's a more significant change. So in the top, the darkest portions are where flood risk increases more and more. So as pretty much expected, you can see the coastal areas of Houston, the flood risks increase pretty dramatically. And the bottom is the precipitation increase based on the different CMIP 6 models, sort of aggregated and then used as a whole. And one thing I should mention is that the First Street Foundation actually doesn't forecast the risk scores. So we had to augment the data set by using a neural network to predict the risk scores based on the other factors that they do forecast. So now that we have these futures precipitation and flood risk scenarios, we can actually then use the causal flow setup to estimate what the median flood loss would be for each of these zip codes. So you can see as both precipitation and flood risk changes over the years, over 2030, 2040, 2052, flood loss estimates also change. And you can see generally it gets worse. And more importantly, the question that we can answer is how would a program like the CRS help these communities in the future? So again, this is for the flood loss savings. So as the colors get darker, that means the program is actually saving communities more and more money. So it's reassuring to see that in 2052, the flood losses will, the savings will increase pretty significantly. It looks much nicer on my laptop. And so we went ahead and we were able to do this for Houston, New York, and just moments ago, Chicago. So you can actually see how the flood loss and predict, sort of forecast how well they'll do. So that's mainly what we achieved during the hackathon. And so now what's left is really the fun part, which is we have all of this information about income, population, all these demographics, and we have how effective we think the flood adaptation program like CRS will be in the future. So we can see how well it correlates with, for instance, income and other factors, racial and ethnic diversity, and then really make more tailored and detailed examinations about how well does this program work for underserved zip codes or communities, for diverse communities, and all of these detailed things that we want to answer. And I think it'll be really, I think in general, this provides a really nice tool for policymakers to answer these very detailed questions about not only does a policy work in a binary yes or no, but really how much and for which communities.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Quick hands coming up, Jason, and then Ethan.
I'm gonna ask if you can go back a few slides, actually. So, I don't know the slide number, but it's maybe like 4 slides back, that platform, yeah. It seemed a little counterintuitive to me that you see that, the savings for 2052 in the top left is higher, but that's not really reflected in the flood risk. And I think, do you have any like thoughts on that? Is our model that we have
So,
for flood risk? not
Yeah, that's actually really interesting. So I don't have the figure up yet, but if you look at the income distribution, those are the high income areas of Houston. And so in our first paper, one of the intriguing things we found is that some of the highest income communities, they claim to have much higher flood losses. And we think this is an example of elite capture.
Yeah, they kind of, like also going to the field and, doing some interviews, we learned that there's some ways to, game the system. So it really, we only found this for like richer communities where people actually may use the program to kind of refurbish their patio, things like that. If they know how to do it, so, yeah.
Interesting, thank you.
Okay, Ethan, and then, Patrick, and then I think there was some other hands, and then Julie.
So it's really hard to forecast some things like income that are driving a lot of the model, like the savings, right? So you have, state-of-the-art models for the flood risk and so on, but I don't know how confident we can be where, I don't know if you incorporate a population projection, like where you think population will be located, even without any socioeconomic characteristics. And it may not be feasible, but I think you could give the readers maybe some reassurance if you look 50 years ago at these places and say, okay, we still see the same distribution of wealthy neighborhoods or still wealthy neighborhoods today, so on, things like that, maybe.
Yeah.
That's an excellent suggestion.
Yeah,
I think that would be one of the bigger critiques.
Yeah.
Especially given the dynamics around the built environment.
Yeah.
Yeah, not only income. Okay.
It was a duplicate, so.
Okay. Question.
Oh, so this is just a simple interpretation question, so thank you, Jason. This is the slide I wanted to go to. So your savings aren't cumulative? So like, it looks like one of the, I don't know if those are zip codes, in 2052, assuming that darker means more savings.
Yeah.
It's darker in 2040 and kind of the upper right-hand corner of that plot. And
Oh, yeah, it's not cumulative.
It's not
It's
cumulative, so
like,
it's difference between like 2030 to 2040, 2040 to 2052.
Yeah.
Okay.
and actually, the reason why in some places it's higher here is that if the CMIPS maps for the precipitation actually has higher precipitation happening in 2040 or whatever.
Yeah, they were kind of like this for some.
Yeah, so
reason.
it
Some of the
fluctuates.
models, yeah.
So Fabian and then Jason.
Yeah, question about the CRS program. How is your treatment assigned? Is it like, randomly it happens, or is it like
It is
something?
not random,
Yeah.
but this is why actually using like traditional econometric tools would deliver not very good results. And when you need like this type of approach.
How does this causal model work? How can you recover the causal effect? That's my underlying question.
So we condition on all of the community properties that we think matter for affecting the outcome. And so we're effectively building two models, one for the control sample, one for the treated. And we can only measure the treatment effect for that overlap of where there's both communities in the control and the treated. But for those communities, we can accurately assess this. And for the CRS program, I guess to its credit, the overlap is most communities. So in terms of population, income, all of these factors, they're pretty reflective of each other. So
balances.
Yeah.
Good question. Jason?
So how did you incorporate the different, 6 runs, all the different simulations, and then also, do you see that actually being really helpful? Just as a big picture, like the different, like actually incorporating CNET things? 2 questions there.
Well, so we incorporated, you gave us the 36 models, which were great, thank you. And so we at first tried to calculate it for each model, but instead what we ended up doing is just aggregating it and then looking at the median of the max monthly precipitation of the year, and then using that value. This was mainly just to reduce stochasticity because, if we just took each models, sometimes precipitation plummeted in 2040 and then went back up really high. So that would make these maps look kind of crazy. And also it's more about a question of like, for the policymaker, looking at stochastic variations of precipitation is not exactly what's most informative for policymaking, right? So we wanted to sort of just look, we wanted to use the general trend in change in precipitation. And as for whether it's useful, I think the short answer is yes. But I have to say, I thought precipitation would change more.
Jorge.
Yeah.
So I would like to add something. So the data that Zissou shared, it was SSP 585, but we might try some other scenarios as well.
Jorge and, Andrew Rector.
I'm just curious about how are you incorporating some social variables and also some housing information, like for example, the ratio between homeowners and renters, because when you were saying like the higher income are playing the system, I'm thinking if the higher income areas, most of them are homeowners, and you know that there is a risk and there is a way for you to have to use a French lanes, which are very expensive, and you know about the program, you can apply and do it, but in a lower income, if there is more renters, first they don't care. Even if they get flooded, it's not the property, so in a lot of times, renters don't take as much care of the property. And then if they don't know as well about the programs, then I don't know if it would be appropriate to say that they are taking advantage of the program, or maybe they're very informed. So I don't know if there is a way to kind of incorporate that into the model.
So this was actually one of our hypotheses in the previous paper, and we incorporated renters and non-renters, and there was no, very surprisingly for me, because I totally, like, in the literature and everything, like, people talk about this issue, and also it's politically an issue when these programs are discussed, even though the CRS has actually done a lot to address that, and you can access the program as a renter, and there's like new incentives to join, even if you're not the owner. But we found actually no distinctive effect, which I was surprised by.
Yeah.
If you want to say anything.
But with that said, we do incorporate it as one of the covariates.
Yeah, I forgot
because
to put in the slide.
in terms of like the causal path, I think our intuition was it should matter.
Yeah,
But
the
in
percentage
terms
for
of
what you're saying.
when we measure it, it didn't really have a very noticeable effect.
Yeah, Andrew. And that last question.
Okay, so a point on the difference in 2040 and 2052. So essentially, like, we've done some work on this as well, and it highlights the importance of understanding the decadal variability that sometimes is not as clear as it should be, you know, and I think it is important when speaking with policymakers about that. I mean, it's very commonly left out of the discussion, but I think it matters in some contexts, and maybe some other contexts it matters less. But especially if we're talking about certain types of floods, you know, like the pluvial flooding, essentially the flash flooding, I think it can make a very big difference. But that was my question, is related to the type of flood and how you disaggregated by flood type. You know, was that a part of your process, or in terms of just calling all flood rather than like, I guess like storm surge element versus pluvial element?
So because we wanted to look at cities that have very different geographies, we actually on purpose chose the Forest Street Foundation measurement of flood risk that takes into consideration tidal flooding, geographical characteristics that lead to flooding, inland flooding, etc. So it was the most comprehensive one, but that means that you cannot really differentiate. And you know, that makes sense, can make a difference for sure.
Great first three presentations. Thank you so much. We'll take a 15-minute break and some more coffee and stuff. Potentially some yeast, and I'll be back.
So what is? Oh, yeah,
Still working. All of these different strategies are.
Yeah, so I'll be quiet.
Talk about your part, like
Yeah.
It's gonna be a way to search for.
I have a hidden slide, and we can hit it in the,
Oh, yeah. Well, let's go through It's a, yeah, slide. It's a kitty.
Actually, we're like a cat demonstration project. I know, so it's like, oh, you can say something like. We don't have. On there. Okay, so yeah, we have this. I figured we do first couple slides, this one, I couple Taylor, I can put together. And then I'll get it off to you. Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
You guys all set?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I'll do that. I'll hand it over to Jorge, to do this one, and that one. And this one is a hidden one.
Yeah, let me find
it.
Yeah, that would be better.
You want me to unhide it? I got it.
So because I kind of start talking about it and then I'm going to.
Yeah.
And then the last one is.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, go ahead.
I don't think carefully, but.
Always like.
I feel like. Already, even if you want to stop there.
I'm gonna do this one too, because I think it's also. Okay, guys, I'm gonna.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So, do you know, there might be a way, but I'm not very familiar with it, to do like the collaboration in a script using supercomputer? If, for example, we're working together in a script, is there a way to do that in our supercomputer to have like the game?
Yeah, use, well, you have the other. And you just have your branch, my branch, and do pull requests. Are you doing this for the software project?
But not with the HPC.
All the only thing is just like downloading it to your local machine.
Yeah.
You just get clone on.
Okay.
That's all it is.
Okay, that's the part that I.
Yeah, just get clone.
Yeah, for projects I was using Git Kraken.
Git
Kraken.
Oh.
It's like a form of great. Okay, that's it.
Yeah, I know there's a number of programs that have like Git. So you just use it all right, because you're doing it. Also, the other thing you can use VS Code. That's a way, like you can, if you use VS Code, you can log it, you can actually have it run stuff on the
I have no definition of VS.
Yeah, I'll log on.
Let's get started. I know we had a few people who are still getting their coffee, but I think we'll just get started.
They're gonna miss the good parts.
I know. I could go gather them up, but, yeah, thanks, everybody. Thanks to the first two groups. That was fantastic. Okay. And we have the cat group. Let's get going.
We have 15 minutes, right? 'Cause
You have 15. I'll be starting the timer now.
Okay, so we are the CAT, as Andrea and Jorge wonderfully described the other day, the CAT demonstration project. And so of course I couldn't resist putting in demonstrations of my cats being cats in the way that they are. You can't really see it, but his tongue is hanging out there. This is Obe and Tally. So it's important to think about cat demonstration. We don't have t-shirts, but we have pictures of our cats doing what they do. So just really briefly, I'm gonna start this off and say a tremendous thank you to the new folks who really deeply contributed to our project this week. It really does illustrate the value of the Hack Week from our perspective. So of course, we have our team that Andrea and Jorge introduced the other day, all in little raindrops. And then of course, now Tyler gets a raindrop because he helped us a lot with pulling some of the census data so that we could examine our sample representativeness. And then serendipitously, when we were working in the common space the other day, Spencer Wood, who I believe is a senior research scientist here in E-Sciences, overheard us talking about some of the challenges with our mobility data, and then just dropped some knowledge about how he has worked quite a bit with it, actually even done some surveys with companies, vendors who provide this kind of information. And in particular, provided some awesome information about the Scikit mobility, which DJ is gonna, as a tool, which DJ is gonna talk quite a bit more about. So a tremendous thank you to them for contributing to our thinking. So just a couple of slides, and I'll hand it off to DJ. So a reminder, I know you all heard a lot about this the other day, but this is the essence of, is there a way I can make this like not show this? I'm not good with Zoom, how to make that little part. Well, anyway, it's the essence of what we're trying to do here. Thank you, Courtney.
Yeah.
Is remember, we have this data, this longitudinal panel data, where we surveyed people multiple times leading up to an atmospheric river event. And we had a lot of measures on that survey, and the measure that in particular we're looking at, thank you, is whether or not during the last 24 hours, you or anyone in your household have changed or canceled your plans to reduce or avoid driving. It wasn't actually underlying this in the survey, but I'm doing that here. So it's kind of a self-report measure, right, of their behaviors. And then we also wanted to collect data from these different vendors. And in particular, we now, as DJ will show, have data, cell phone measurement data of movement from Veriset data. And we also have some sample data that is GPS measures of vehicle trajectory from AirSafe. We decided in the interest of time not to talk about that today. So really exploring the similarities and differences of the self-report and this in situ kind of observational mobility data. That's the essence of what we're trying to do today here with the Hack Week efforts. And then if I could make this advance, potentially make this advance, hold on, there we go. Another piece is that we wanted to evaluate the representativeness of our survey sample data. So this is again where we really appreciate the efforts of Tyler. I'm just kind of at a quick high level looking at the zip code data that the data and the zip codes that we had survey data from, comparing it with the American Community Survey data. And I think there's some more nuances in there that Tyler can kind of convey for us. We did our samples pretty similar, sort of in terms of gender. Our sample is a little bit more white. That's probably not too surprising. A little bit higher representation in terms of Black, but that's actually partly because of the way that we sampled. We incentivized certain groups a little bit more. Tyler, remind me the NA for the ACS for Hispanic.
Yeah,
it was because
Hispanic is not a race, but in your study, it was considered a race.
we put it only in one variable. That's why.
So that other actually, I think, really nicely captures really, I think it's probably individuals as Hispanic, register as Hispanic in your study, and that you actually combine other and Hispanic, you're getting, exactly what you would expect.
Wonderful, yes.
And white as well.
And white as well.
Probably why.
Yeah, wonderful, thank you. So a little bit more data there, and with that, I think I'm about ready to now hand it off to DJ to talk about the sample data we finally have.
Yeah, so pretty exciting. After a lot of chatting back and forth and cloud, the bucket shenanigans, we finally have sample data from Veriset. So for those who aren't familiar with Veriset, they provide for whatever region, they provide basically all the cell phone location pings from, I think everyone. Looking at our data, we had, I think roughly, so I picked one day, so this is March 27th in California, and we had, basically kind of per individual users is sort of the parallel distribution of, like how many location pings did we get from each person. So a lot of raw data, some people like very active 10,000 pings, and most are kind of in the range of like less than 100. But so there's a lot it's very raw data. There's a lot to it. We want to pull from that because we're ultimately interested in people's like mobility patterns and like how much, like when are they traveling, how long are they like going to different places and stuff. And so, so like what is actually in this data? But basically we get things like lat line, unique ID, whether or not it's an Android or Apple device, IP address, horizontal accuracy. So not only do we get a location, we kind of get a rough estimate of how good their system thinks the location is, and then also some other geocoding information and a timestamp. And we got a whole bunch of like 100 million of these. The data is stored in Parquet file format, which for those who aren't familiar with it it's like CSV, except instead of in raw text, it's in binary, and the compression is done on a column by column basis. So if you only want to load in a subset of your columns, and you have a lot of rows, this can be a way to, and if you have a lot of columns too, this can be a way to not blow your RAM on your machine. Because try to load everything in first, and that was a problem. Even on the in-car supercomputer, my 128 gigs of RAM was like, so we so kind of give you an idea, for one day, we have 100 million rows and 6 million unique user IDs. I'll talk a little bit more about how we process the data in subsequent slides, but actually on this one. So how do we actually deal with this this data? So thanks to Spencer's suggestion, we are using Scikit Mobility. I got to play around with it a lot yesterday. You can do things like you can estimate approximate home location, and there's an algorithm for that in the package. We can look at total duration of movement per person per day, total distance traveled per person per day, and we can aggregate both across people, so we can see what are they doing on each day, and then also across areas. So like, does the population change? And because we have the very raw data, we can do this however we want, and we're not at the mercy of whatever vendor did this for us. And so the idea of what we want to do is compare this with like as initial baseline. So we know when the atmospheric river event was. Our baseline would be like the week before, so same day. So you're kind of trying to at least control for work, school kind of stuff, and similar in time. And hopefully you have the same people being pinged on both weeks for the most part. So we should have some overlap. We're wanting to get more data to look at other kinds of baselines, but that's still a little down the road. Next, I'll hand it over to Jorge to talk about some of the other analysis he was doing with some of the flooding data.
So since we have so much information, the first task that we took was identifying the best way to tackle this data. So we're focusing initially in those areas with predicted exposure. So by that are basically zip codes that receive a warning. So for example, here we focus on Santa Barbara County, zip codes. So when we want to make sure that they actually receive some water and so some impacts. So we did a very quick calculation of the flooded areas in that region. So when we look at this region in Santa Barbara, we have 3 zip codes where we have data. So if we focus on this region, and I'm sorry that the lighting is not great, we can observe that Highway 101 got flooding based on the radar data. And when we look at reports from the New York Times, and I know it's really challenging to see, but you'll see a photo of a flooded highway. And now, because we're focusing on this specific region, one of the things that is advantageous of this data is that they have a zip code of where some of those pins are. So for example, based on that, we identified one user that was in this area. So you can tell that they start driving at 6:02 and they arrived to our area of interest at 6:39, and this was for March 21st. And I'll give it to DJ to expand on the data.
So this is one example of like kind of basic psychomobility aggregation where you get a start and end in the path, but we can also get some other things. So in addition, I picked out another random track from the data and was able to plot not just start and end location, but also stops, like how long when did they arrive at the place, when did they leave, kind of coordinate that, who the user is. They have a nice integration of Folium, which is a way to kind of display data on like a kind of leaflet style map. So you can do other kinds of easy visualization geocoding. There's also so we can get other, also we have home location stops, length of stops, and kind of look at that statistically eventually as you basically parallel process this over all the people. I think we still need a way to extract driving patterns, because one thing I did notice with the data is sometimes you get very frequent pings, and sometimes you, in Jorge's example, the pings are like here and then here. So if you're estimating, trying to estimate speed and other road condition kind of stuff, that we'll need to do a lot of quality control to dig down to who actually has more frequent pings, I expect. And in some cases, some people jumping where they're here and then suddenly they're halfway across the state. So, joy of raw data. Final conclusion of this is I think the mobility data is both very powerful, but also kind of scary, because there's 6 million, population of California is 36 million people, and we got 6 million unique user IDs on one day that I have access to now, and there's a lot of ways to. I think there's a lot of power in ways we can use it for good, but we also need to be mindful of ethically, how do we not use this for inadvertently especially inadvertently use this for nefarious purposes. Obviously we don't intend to use this for nefarious purposes, but it's definitely with this data combined with other data, there's a lot of ways it can go wrong, as I'm sure you all are well aware as demographers. But as a meteorologist, this is a lot of new stuff for me. So I've appreciated the learning process and getting to work with this team and understanding all the subtleties and kind of expanding my world. So thank you.
And that's where we're at.
Great.
Thank you.
Handle questions
And I should offer Andrea, Sarah, anything you wanted to add to anything we covered?
Oh, I'm curious, so, you showed how, there was a straight line, and it's hard to really tell, where it fits on a specific, road path. Can you explain, how you control and get it to more in line with, a real actual, driving pattern, or is there,
We haven't gotten to that point yet.
Okay.
It depends on the data, the person. Some of them have very frequent updates, so they follow exactly along the road. And you can see them going back and forth on the same road. But others are like that, where you only get a few pings.
can you make assumptions of cause the things were far, but they were both on the highway.
Yeah,
So you can
you probably could do a spline fit or something that if you can intersect it with the road, if you have the road polygon or road line path or whatever, I think you can certainly make some assumptions if we wanted to get more uniform data. I think the big question for us is that, how much effort is that? And is that effort needed to get what we want to get out of the project?
Yeah, so the idea would be what change do you wanna, what is the change that you wanna observe? in
Yeah.
people's behavior and how, how do we get at a measure? You know, how much, what do we need to do to get at a measure that will help us see change in behavior?
Yeah.
That isn't, either too aggregated and summative and then maybe not show us anything, or take so much work, it shows so much heterogeneity that we're not gonna see something capturing the meaningful change in behavior is the key challenge, I think.
So I'm curious then, if like, so just to follow up, so for that example, like it's on the highway, so you can make it, like do a calculation, make an assumption, but the highway's flooded, it's gonna be harder to calculate kind of the off-road they take. Is it better than to just like drop those observations or try to, don't know yet?
I think
Big question mark.
there's an inherent trade-off. It's, I mean, in some ways it's easier to drop some of the stuff, and there's some cases where we'll have to drop because they just aren't doing, they're sending us to a location, so we just don't know.
I also think kind of in general, we wanna, like, going back, that's part of the reason I really wanna emphasize the measure from the survey we're comparing against, which is again, like reducing or avoiding driving.
Yeah.
And when in the period of our survey data collection would we anticipate that to happen, right? Especially when we're thinking about kind of NOAA recommendations for people to kind of stop being on the roads, right? So kind of thinking about maybe right when the rainfall is starting to happen, or when some of those flood warnings are going into effect, or when flooding has actually happened, that we might see self-reported behavior, and then we actually do want to think about how do we aggregate at the right scale and space and time, that we might potentially use this mobility data to sort of see behaviors of people either not on the road or getting off someplace else, to be able to compare more directly with our survey data. But since we just got the data, what, Wednesday morning?
Yeah.
And I just saw how much there was, it's like, how do we even like break down the problem in such a simplified way to start making sense of the data and what we can do with it? So Andrea.
I just wanted to pick up too, like part of our question here is not necessarily filling everybody into, it's trying to decide, is that person driving, is that person walking? And we need to do a lot of sensitivity analysis really with, you know, if a point is directly on an interstate, does it matter how fast it's moving, or can we assume that's actually someone in a car, you know, potentially in backup? And so I think that we're just gonna have to work with a lot of different sort of decision trees. And, you know, tune those sensitivities to see how much it matters so that we can get a final data set. Because ultimately, you know, what we're most interested in for our research, this particular research project, is whether people are driving, and where they're going. So, because we have other questions related to behaviors regarding getting emergency supplies and prepping their vehicles. So things like, are they going to gas stations? And so, yeah, we're gonna have to let those questions guide how we do this.
Okay, I'm gonna collect 2 questions, or 3 maybe. So Beth, Alexis, and Masha, and then we'll let you guys answer those. So take notes.
This is more of a comment. First of all, I want to say that, as a former New Orleans resident, watching the news last night and seeing flooding and people getting swept away in their cars, this just brings home how valuable this research can be. And I'm also, to get directly to the point, one of the things that people do is, rather than avoid driving altogether, is avoid known flood points.
Yeah,
Which is what people in houses do. You still have to go places, but you know the places that currently flood. So it could be super interesting and like a great benefit to the community to collect data from them about which places they specifically avoid if they do have to drive. And then maybe their own knowledge about when you have to turn back instead of like trying to drive through that flood spot. And so that's the knowledge base that people need to have to navigate these situations. So I think it's really, what you're doing, having the real-time information is great. I'm just thinking about like an NSF proposal where you get community engagement and have broader impacts, like that kind of feedback from the respondents could be really useful in making this a two-way conversation, as opposed to what you're doing right now, which is sort of just, you know, collecting the avoidance behavior. So, great job.
Great idea.
The one comment I would have as a demographer, and this is gonna sound really cranky, but I know that you guys is an opt-in panel survey. And so that does represent some, it's an unobserved bias. And how is it that you need to ask yourself, how are the people who opt into participating in a YouGov panel survey different from those people who wouldn't?
I'm just gonna collect,
Okay.
I'm collecting, sorry, then we can, so Alexis and then Masha, yeah, and then we'll.
Mine's a very quick one. I think your demographics are actually more in line with the US composition than not. I think the ACS does have a table that is Hispanic origin and race. And so what's happening is a lot of the Hispanic, the population you would classify as Hispanic are ending up in the white categories or the black categories. So if you just rerun those descriptives, I think it's gonna match relatively well.
Okay, Masha,
Hopefully pretty simple, but are you gonna try to access the full data set, since the sample data set is the days that you want? So that's one question, and then I guess I have two, which is, the second question is, how are you going to, integrate the data? At what scale? Are you gonna try to match the survey to the mobility data, or are you gonna find trends at some higher scale and match those?
so Anne, did you wanna respond to Beth at
Well, I
all?
just want to say that, I mean, the big, one of my big interests in this is thinking about, I mean, the motivation to do YouGov is driven by the practicalities of trying to do the longitudinal survey on such a short time scale, and the practice that Julie talked about before. And so one of my big interests has been this sort of representative issue, because I'm a big fan of survey methodology, and this response bias, this unobserved response bias is really important. So we are still going to continue to investigate how we can link various ways of linking the ACS data with the survey data, see if we can learn anything more about that in this context, and think about the practicalities of how we could advise researchers going forward on how to capture changes in both people's perceptions and knowledge and attitudes and their behaviors in an integrated way. So it's a great question.
And I can add to that briefly too.
Yep.
So that is a great question. The other thing I'll say is when we first started doing this, I might have said this the other day, so forgive me if I'm repeating myself. We first started doing this with hurricanes. We worked with a lot of companies and most of them said, we can't even do this. We can't even survey people in a 24-hour time frame with a 24 and get you a sufficient sample size, especially given that there's some uncertainty about where it's going to be affected. So we're making decisions about where to field like 24 hours in advance. So I think the complexities of trying to do this with a unpredictable or limited predictability real world event is part of what also intersects with this. But we also, so some of our first order efforts was just to see what kind of data could we get and then think about how to improve that and think about even if there are ways to improve the representativeness, but of course, we have to evaluate that.
So, Fabian, I'm gonna collect questions again, Fabian and Matt.
Oh, shoot, should we just answer Masha's question?
Masha's question about, data.
I can add a little bit about it. So in the discussions we had, so we know what were the responses at the zip code level. So one of the projects that we were considering is we can identify the home of the users in that zip code. And because we have the unique ID of those users living in that zip code, we can see the changes in their behavior during and after the event. And based on that, we will have an idea of first, what were the changes in the driving patterns at that zip code level? If a region of the zip code had more changes and then aggregate that information at the zip code level to make it more comparable. Saying, for example, 50% said that they were going to change the responses. And we're seeing like, well, actually 70%, only 30% did it, but it was 50% in this area of the zip code did it. So that's something that we are still considering, but those are some of the strategies that we were discussing.
And are you gonna try to get the sample, the full data?
Yes.
Yeah.
We're not just gonna steal the sample.
Already what you want. Rather than take, I'm gonna collect questions, but we're not gonna have answers, so you guys can talk to people later, but I want the audience to hear the questions, and then we're gonna grade. Okay, Matt, did you have, Fabian, Matt?
Okay, thank you. Briefly, so, I think you have a very powerful design. I was wondering whether there's a way to, even exploit it further, because a lot of like this changing behavior, they can also messaging, and like maybe there's a way to actually work with like local municipality authorities to look at which message works best, what information is is most convey risk, to the users. I wonder if that's something you plan for the future on.
We have those data. That's my short answer.
Oh,
So,
cool.
We do, in the survey.
Yeah, so I've published a suite of papers looking at the effect of recurrent tidal flooding or nuisance flooding on commuting behaviors in the US, including climate gentrification, including mortality. So but we didn't have individual level data, we were using census data to look at commuting flows. So I have a lot of ideas and I would just love to just meet, talk about it.
Nice. That's what's supposed to happen. Awesome. Okay, we are going to break. Thank you so much, Kat. We're going to do the panel.
So DJ and I stay here?
Yeah, DJ
Okay.
stays.
We'll take like
3 minutes. Okay.
I think it's this window that's washing out. Julie has a background on her demo. So she wants to-
Are they in the slide deck? Yes, they're in the slide deck that we are.
Okay. Do you know anything about this one? Yeah. Okay, cool.
Like anyone else. Yeah, I promise it's just 2 slides.
Oh, okay. You're fine. You're doing animation.
Yeah, yeah.
Really pleased to welcome you right back to the uncertainty panel discussion, and I'm really looking forward to it. I think each of our panel discussions have been really robust and important and generative, and I have no doubt that the same will be true for the uncertainty panel, especially because we've got 3 great panelists. Just quickly, we'll introduce, I know all of you have heard from Julie and DJ already, so maybe I won't introduce you guys, but I wanted to introduce you to Jessica Godwin, who is a statistical demographer at CSTE. She's also trained in Bayes methods through the University of Washington Statistics Program and PhD is in that field. She's an expert in spatiotemporal estimation techniques and small area estimations or sparse data and estimation, or sparse data context. And has done work with UNICEF on under 5 child mortality estimations in very low sparse data environments. So we're really delighted to have her here and to be part of this uncertainty panel. We've talked a bit about a number of data integration, issues around, oh my goodness, I'm blanking now. But lots of examples of bringing data together. And one thing that hasn't really been discussed to date is, the challenges of bringing different kinds of data together. And the ways in which we make assumptions about the nature and the quality of those data. Also how we represent uncertainty to the public, to decision makers, even if we had perfect data, as we were talking earlier, how do you represent to decision makers, well, this is a model built on, a certain set of assumptions, and we're not sure if those are the right assumptions. So when we do that, that raises all sorts of questions in the decision maker, policymakers' minds around, okay, so how do I make a decision? How do I understand how to do that? And how do we think about that? As well as people, individual people, and how they make their decisions around how to think about risk. So I think it's one of the most challenging components of what we're doing and in general in terms of translating research to application. So I had 2 discussion questions for you. What are the promising approaches to representing and analyzing different kinds of uncertainties in the results of analyses of integrated data sets? And how can those uncertainties be carried through and presented to inform decision makers in a useful way? Thank you. And I think, Julie, you want to start us off?
Sure,
Are you the first set of slides?
Well, I was gonna, do you want, or I'm
DJ.
gonna do a demo with my computer. So DJ, do you want?
I have slides, I have a couple slides.
Okay.
So kind of in the interest of answering first the promising approaches and then how we're gonna carry this through. I'm going to escape and come back in, and the magic of Google, auto syncing. Ta-da! So my group has been working on a project for about the past year and a half-ish, and we're on kind of digging into machine learning uncertainty quantification. In particular, like the reason we were driven by this is because when we worked with Julie's group on doing forecaster interviews, a lot of what they were interested in, one of the things they were interested in, like, when is the model going to do well and when is it going to fail? Well, I mean, you don't always know what that is a priori, or else we wouldn't have to do prediction problems, I think, but we can, but with the appropriate uncertainty quantification, we can at least get some sense of where the model thinks estimates it might fail. And we can do this, so in this example, we're looking at winter precipitation type, and we take so this is a temperature profile and dew point profile of the atmosphere, on the right is our wind profile with height. We feed this into our basically machine learning model. In this case, if you use a traditional machine learning model, one of the issues that comes up is it only, if it's predicting a problem, like a classifier model, it's only giving you a Latorque uncertainty, because the only uncertainty it learns is based off of the underlying data. If you want to sample the uncertainty from the model, you have kind of your model choices and whether or not there's good sampling for the model to be well constrained, that is an epistemic uncertainty, and you can kind of get at that with an ensemble. You can sample some of that uncertainty. But there's also ways that you assume a parametric higher order distribution, which I think Jessica's going to get into more of the Bayesian aspects of this, but kind of take a more Bayesian approach to having some prior assumption about how your uncertainty variables are related to each other. You can get this orange curve on here that kind of gives you a fuller distribution of uncertainty for both classification and regression type problems. We can also from that derive other ways to represent the uncertainty. So this is kind of a PDF,
like a PDF on a probability is kind of weird, so maybe you just want one number that you can share with your people. So in this case, we can say there's like a 70% chance of sleep, but then there's also a 20% chance that the outcome isn't really clear. And if you want to compare this case, like take this value and then use it to sort your data set, link it back to the inputs, we can then kind of get a sense of how does in situations with more uncertainty, basically we can see physically reasonable changes in the sounding structure. So these are snow sounding, so like you expect guaranteed snow, temperature should be really low, guaranteed rain, temperature should be well below freezing. For freezing, rain, and sleep, they are inherently harder to predict because they're right around zero, and they have very similar shapes to the profile, but there's subtle differences in the height of basically the part that's above freezing and then how warm it is near the surface. And I'm also able to learn that and then use the uncertainty as a way to diagnose that for us. Then we can feed this into case studies that we show to forecaster. So the example on the right kind of shows how we can bring in other weather information to provide that additional context so that the forecaster can make sense of what the uncertainty is telling them. We have a software package on this called Miles Guess that we've implemented this evidential deep learning method, and we have a paper, it's on archive. We're working on getting the minor revisions done this week and trying to get it resubmitted. So it'll hopefully be out in AI for their systems pretty soon. One of the other cool kind of ways to think about the uncertainty too is not just so this is kind of getting into the explainable AI. So those are like kind of broad profiles, but you can also think about it in terms of like multivariate regimes. So in this case, what we're doing is picking basically a grid of values basically across the marginals of this wind speed and temperature gradient, and we're trying to predict the sensible heat flux, as well as the uncertainties associated with that. The gray contours are how many examples we have in the training data, and then so anything outside this white line is basically the model hasn't seen these examples, this part of the space before. So this allows us to see like how does the model behave in the space, and then how does it behave outside of the space. So in, like what's technically and the marginals is an interpolation regime, but in the joint heat distribution is an extrapolation regime. And what we see is there's clear regime behavior, which we expect from basically from our knowledge of turbulent, like physics and turbulence, like in this regime where basically you're unstable, you have convective plumes, a lot of movement. This is driven heavily by the temperature gradient and like just how unstable is it. On this side, you're basically stable, you have more laminar flow, like at night, think nighttime. So if there's any mixing, vertical mixing, it's going to be due to changes in the wind speed near the surface. So that's why we see basically there's very little sensitivity to the temperature gradient over here, and then suddenly there's a lot. So it's a fairly nonlinear problem. We can look at how, so this is apparent in both the predictions and in all the different uncertainties. But we can also look at how the ratio of the epistemic and alloic uncertainty change. We see basically epistemic uncertainty dominating as you get out into this part of the space, and alloic torque sort of flattens off. So which I think would be expected. What's more unusual is like alloic torque continues to increase in this part of the space, where epistemic also is increasing, but at a slower rate. So there's some interesting dynamics that we can get into with this kind of more like intentional exploration of the models. So with that, I'll turn it over to Julie.
Do you want Jessica to go? I'm talking about decisions, so I wonder if someone.
Oh, that's actually, because I don't spend much time on it.
Okay. And I love your cat tattoo.
Oh, thank you. I got this. If any of you are here tomorrow, I got this at a tattoo studio in Capitol Hill called Super Genius, and tomorrow is Friday the 13th, and they always have flash sheets and cheaper tattoos, so I will plug them. This was a Halloween flash one there.
I can see claim to flame going out.
Yeah. Okay, so I guess before I get started, I just want to say that I am, as Sarah said, I'm coming at this well after all of the physics and all of the actual modeling of weather. So I'm not really thinking about models where we know physics, or maybe there is this like real pathway of how our data is being generated. I'm really thinking about once we incorporate people, first of all, as a demographer, and sort of taking outputs from people like DJ's work and combining it with information about people or households, and then where do we go from there? So I know that I would say that the frequentist Bayesian wars are sort of déclassé these days, but I think that if you're dealing with multiple types of uncertainty, the statistical answer almost always is to go Bayesian. I think frequentist methods are fine, but maybe just not in this scenario. And I want to call out a couple things that I think are really relevant. One, I think it's really important for us to really think about all of our different data sources and what is the difference between bias and uncertainty. Just because one data set is different from some other data set that you're looking at, is that a systematic difference? That's bias. That has nothing to do with our uncertainty, right? You have 3 different data streams and one is giving a different need. That doesn't mean we're talking about uncertainty, right? That's a bias or a difference that we might need to account for, which we're going to account for in the model somewhere, in the mean model, not thinking about uncertainty. The other thing is, often we're combining survey data with something else. With all other types of data in statistics land, we're assuming there's measurement error, right? That's the uncertainty that we're thinking about. But we want to be very careful when we have survey data to think about the sampling error, which needs to be dealt with in a different way. And then, of course, this is hugely relevant for everyone in this room. We have to be mindful of what types of uncertainty are happening when we're thinking about the relationship between our data points, right? Do we have dependence in that uncertainty? Is it temporal, spatial, spatiotemporal? Is it seasonal? Do we have dependence across age? And then that's going to change how we need to model uncertainty, right? If we have independent observations, we're going to model uncertainty differently than if we have a time series, right? So we need to think about the relationships between our data and really, if you don't have these methods, going into the literature, looking at what do people do with temporal data, if that's my problem. Uncertainty in the denominator is something that none of us like to think about, but we all know it's there. And I think especially those of you who are using ACS data, this is one of the, the things we all, we love the ACS, but we hate about it. And I just wanted to, if you didn't know, there's some really cool recent work happening in this space. I'm gonna call out 2 papers by Emily Peterson and a group of other people, but this one is actually specific to the US and it uses Bayesian hierarchical modeling to get small area population estimates that combines all of the Census Bureau data types and models the way those data are generated or sampled. So we have the decennial census, we have the population estimates program, and then the American Community Survey, which a lot of us use, but it also models their uncertainty and understands that the uncertainty in the census is going to be different than the uncertainty in the ACS, which is a household survey, and it's going to be different than the uncertainty in the population estimates program, which is how we get annual post-census estimates between a decade. The same author, I saw this at PAA, I think last year, and I just think this is the coolest for many of us who do small area approach. We don't have to worry just about uncertainty in our estimate of the denominator, but how is that, and what's the residual correlation between those uncertainties when we're dealing with discrete space, right? And so there's actually, this is on opioid mortality, but I think many of the principles would apply to almost anything that people in this room are doing, where you're going to account for the uncertainty in the denominator. So if you're doing log regression, Poisson regression, you have your log offset, usually that has uncertainty, right? And this is going to account for the spatial dependence between that. And then this is another thing that's sort of out of context, but I think really could be relevant here. It's a quite new paper, not super new, but from another UW person. And this is on the propagation of record linkage uncertainty in the face of human rights violations. But this same kind of record, you have an NGO, they go into a post-disaster place. We have some sort of roll of the number of people displaced. We also have them recorded in some sort of insurance record or something. And we're trying to find the number of people who were displaced, so then we can carry on that uncertainty. So I think those are some pretty cool newer things happening in the Bayesian realm that we tended to use to sweep under the rug. And then one of my kind of soapboxes is that I tend to use discrete space. I know for a lot of things, especially when we're thinking about weather and climate, we have to work on the continuous space. But when it comes to reporting to decision makers, reporting to policymakers, it's really important to remember that there's neither risk nor uncertainty when the risk set size is 0. And so what I mean is we might be looking at hurricane, we might be looking at flooding, But when we're talking about the number of deaths or the number of people displaced, just because a hurricane may hit there, if no one is living there, we don't care about the risk, depending upon our outcome, nor do we need to think about uncertainty, right? So presenting a continuous map that shows a high risk of death or injury from some event in a place where no one lives is sort of irresponsible, but is also adding unnecessary uncertainty to what you're displaying. And then this kind of gets at Sarah's last question about what do we do with policymakers? How do we think about conveying this? And I think it's really important to think about what is their outcome and what do we care about? Sometimes we care about the median, but when we think about things like Adrian Raftery has told this anecdote to me a million times, but back in the 90s, Seattle closed a bunch of schools. Many of you in this room may know that we're about to lose a bunch of elementary schools again. And they did that based on the median number with no uncertainty about the population projection of elementary school sizes. But with something that's as costly and as long to build or rebuild as an elementary school, maybe we care more about the 90% and the 10%. Maybe we want to be really conservative. What if this extreme thing happens? Because if not, we can't rapidly respond and rebuild a school. So I think that's important too to think about. And then this is just for people, for my very specific area, working with sampling, survey data, and small area estimation. I think it's best practice if you have enough sample size to deal with your sampling error first before you deal with space and time or any smoothing. So get your weighted estimates out of something like the survey package in R or the survey package in Stata, and then turn to Bayesian smoothing in space and time. When our sampling variability is large, or we don't have a lot of observations in our small area, then we might need to be thinking about fitting one model on the individual level so that we can account for both the sampling error and this dependency in our residuals at the same time.
Thank you. Great.
I should have asked, I know we've
So
tried
Julie,
this.
Julie's gonna be on a different,
I swap computers.
so we're gonna have to up share.
You could also just join the Zoom call and share from your computer.
Oh, that'll take me like 20 minutes to do if I, like, I'll have to. Does somebody?
Let's see. I want to.
a practical solution, like, you know, but I wanna know how to think about that conceptually. And then I have a second question, but
We got time. We're waiting.
Want to start?
Yeah, I think one thing to be really careful about with on the physical data and the associated uncertainties is, like, the climate projections may have a lower uncertainty than a weather kind of projection of say, like sea surface height change. The part of that is because we're like, often there's a lot of aggregation going on in the 100-year climate projection. So it's not completely apples to apples comparison. So it's one thing, like there's some things that behave really nicely because if you let's say like global aggregations, but once you start getting into downscaling climate data to regions and localities, basically closer to the people scales, the uncertainties go way up. And one of the things you see it in is precip, where if you look at like across, say, the CMIP ensemble, there are like in some areas, like half the models will say precip in California is going up and half the models say it's going to go down. And they all have like their own, like, kind of make good physical assumptions and a lot of consistencies. Even if you maybe throw out some of the outliers, there's still a lot of inherent uncertainty in that when you get to the smaller scales. There's some ways of trying, well, I think some of the climate scientists are trying to address this with, so there's a project called LEAP that's out of Columbia that's trying to build machine learning models to improve our physical representations of small scale processes. And then the idea with that is you plug those into climate models and that should help the climate models be closer to more like captures, maybe especially for things like precipitation. A lot of uncertainty is driven by small scale processes. So if we can improve that, we might be able to narrow some of the uncertainties at the climate scale. But then, yeah, then how's that data getting, like at a certain point, some of that gets abstracted to like, if it's, what number are you feeding into your Bayesian hierarchical model with the people simulations? Like, is that accounting for the physical uncertainty in the scenarios and is it covering the right time scales and all these other pieces? I see this in the reverse coming from the meteorological side and working with social data. Like most, like initial impression getting into some of these projects, like, oh, let's go get a population estimate can you just give me a grid with some population numbers on it? And there's like a deep underappreciation for the level of complexity and modeling that goes into getting those numbers and there's no uncertainty that's being passed along. So I feel like both ends, we need to, like, as we're developing these APIs and data products that are being widely shared and used by people well outside of our communities, especially in this era of open data and open science, we need to be more cognizant of passing along like
either some, like numerical measures of, at least something that's a good first order estimate, that someone might actually use. I mean, you definitely want to document it. There's no guarantee that the users are going to go read the document, so, but at least if there's some ways we can, like, think about with our APIs and how we're sharing data, what is the method of least harm on providing a certain information downstream that might help avoid a lot of misuse of some of this data.
Jessica's one small thing to say.
Yeah.
Turn to Julie.
I know you said you didn't want a technical or specific answer, but I do think, you know, and this is different than the conditional generative models we just saw. You know, when you're doing Bayesian modeling, you have to pick likelihoods and you have to pick models. And so picking a different temporal uncertainty model for different terms than your Bayesian hierarchical model would make sense, right? We think about like random walks or random walk twos. There's a lot of these things where we know that uncertainty just kind of grows like a funnel as you go out from the last point. But if we think about something like, I don't know, an AR with a drift or something that is converging to a point, right? That should end up with if that's the reason we have less uncertainty at 2100 about climate predictions, is that we kind of know where we're going. We just don't know how fast we're going to get there, right? Then you would assume a model that is going to converge to something, and that might get rid of some of the uncertainty, whereas another model would have just blown it up as we go on.
Great. I'm sorry I missed that question. It sounded like it was interesting, so I'll have to hear it again at some point. And speaking of uncertainty, we didn't quite build in, the time it was going to take to do this. But thank you for the help getting me all set up. So I actually, when Anne asked me to be on this panel, I was like, this isn't, I'm not going to talk about like uncertainties with data integration. There are people who are better equipped to do that. But then she convinced me for one. And then I was really thinking about how the fourth D, obviously in D4, is about decisions. So thank you for also bringing that question into our discussion. So what I am going to talk about today, and actually I also want to say, Kit, you set me up beautifully earlier, and something Jessica said set me up beautifully for this. I'm going to talk briefly about an effort that I led, which is sort of separate from the project we're talking about this week, that I was the PI for, which was an interdisciplinary NOAA-funded grant, where we had model developers, people who had expertise in model verification coming together, and then other expertise in risk communication. And it was really kind of this nice, what I would call more the knowledge integration that we talked about the other day, but really also, just to use all the buzzwords, a user-informed research project. And more specifically, what we did is we were focusing on winter weather and fire weather. And we were thinking about how do we take new high-resolution numerical weather prediction models or ensemble prediction systems and create uncertainty information that's really needed and useful for a bunch of different decision makers. And for me, one of those key decision makers is a National Weather Service forecaster, right? Like they're making decisions about what products to issue. So we were doing work with weather service forecasters, with emergency managers, transportation officials, fire weather folks, school officials. And we were doing a bunch of interviews to find out, like, what are their key challenges? What are the decisions that they're trying to make? And how might we derive and verify and provide uncertainty information that's really useful for them? Well, one of the things we always talk about is magnitude, right? How intense, like how strong are the winds going to be? How much snow is there going to be? How much rain is going to fall? And that's really important for their decision making. But the thing that kept coming up over and over and over is timing. Timing of different parameters. When is it going to start to snow? When are those wind gusts going to go above some threshold? When is relative humidity going to drop below 15% because fire risk is going to go increase at that point in time? And not just the most likely time, but also what's the earliest? What's the latest? What's the 10%? What's the 90th? Even if we don't want the whole parts of the distribution. And so what we ended up doing as we were identifying this need from these users, again, working with the rest of our team, is think about, can we use this high resolution ensemble? I'm using something here called the HREF. It's a multi-model. I'm not using it. This is what we are using. It's not like I created the HREF. This is a multi-model ensemble that has 5 members and then also what we call 5 time lag members. And at the time that we were identifying this information need and think about how we provide this to forecasters so that they can then provide it to their core partners, This NOAA Research Lab, it's so hard to see it there, I'm sorry, it's kind of faded out. The Global Systems Lab was developing this web-based interface that they call DESI, Dynamic Ensemble-Based Scenarios for IDSS, which stands for Impact-Based Decision Support Services, so an acronym within an acronym. So we had this opportunity to think about how do we incorporate this kind of timing and timing uncertainty into this platform, which is something that forecasters are using. And so what you can see here, if I just kind of drop down, I know it's a little hard to see, but there's these different drop-down menus with precipitation, and you can get 1 hour precip, 6 hour precip, 24-hour snowfall, etc. And not only can you then generate with this high resolution ensemble forecast, or the ensemble, the magnitude, but also you can see this here, the timing. We have this for precip, we have it for different convective, severe convective parameters, for different surface parameters, including, temperature, dew point, relative humidity, and so forth. So just to kind of show you a little bit of this, and, there's a lot of bells and whistles with this, and a lot of this was not just identifying that timing and timing uncertainty was important, but how do forecasters, what are the features they want to be able to interrogate this information in all the ways that they do. So what I did here, if you can see it, is this is the 0Z run. So this is actually looking at data from last night, and the hurricane kind of gave a nice opportunity to look at timing. And here what we're looking at is it's actually representing time over space, okay? And what I've got here is I've actually set this up to say, well, I'm interested in looking at, and I set the threshold down here, 2 inches of precip over a 24-hour period. What is the time, the most likely time that we're going to actually achieve that threshold of precip being met? And if I kind of do this thing called sampling, it's a little hard to see, and I go over Memphis, well, it's going to tell me that it's going to be about 20 hours from now, or Thursday at 2 p.m., or 20 hours from when the ensemble was, the run was initialized. So Thursday at 2 o'clock. And then if I scroll up a little bit, well, up here further north, it's going to be Thursday at 3 o'clock. Or if I go further south, well, it's going to be Thursday at noon. But kind of to Jessica's point, this is the mean timing, right? But forecasters want to see more than that. So if we can hit this button down here, this is a lot of information. The forecasters are used to looking at a lot of information, so I just want to make that known. Now what we're looking at is kind of the ensemble distribution, right? And if I kind of scroll here, and I'm just going to hover over Memphis again, well, there's a couple of things that are important. So now you can see one of these things is not like the other, that kind of lower right-hand box. This is the percentage. This is the number of members from that ensemble that are saying this threshold is being exceeded, because of course, if they all are, that's telling you something different about the mean, the earliest, the latest, versus say if only half of them are. So that's important for forecasters to look at. But now we can also see here, it's a little hard to see that kind of the mean onset time is Thursday at 2 o'clock here, but the earliest is a few hours earlier, 11 a.m. The latest, which is what's down here, is a couple hours later. But also to Jessica's point, well, maybe they don't want the extreme parts of the distribution. Some forecasters said, like, I don't want to know the outlier, the full distribution. Maybe I want to see the 10th and 90th. I just want to see what's maybe the plausible, most likely, or plausible earliest time. And when I communicate that to my core partners. And in particular, they were interested in all parts of the distribution, again, onset and cessation. But they talked in particular about how important knowing the earliest that something could happen really is for their decision-making and for their core partners, whether it's getting people off the roads, whether it's staffing. Staffing is such a huge thing that came up over and over and over again. When we need to bring people here, when do folks start treating the roads? When do I need to get, for forecasters who are called IMETs, incident meteorologists who are kind of deployed in the field for all the wildfire folks, when do I need to pull people out of the field because we're going to have a chance of those winds kicking up and then maybe the fire is going to really grow in size. All of these kinds of things are shaping their decision making. And what I just kind of wanted to do is show how we have identified kind of this importance about a new variable that wasn't really focused on before, again, this notion of timing, how we incorporated it to be able to illustrate timing and timing uncertainty, but just also all of the different parameters, all of the different ways that you can look at it for different thresholds. You can smooth in different ways. You can do the onset, you can do the cessation, you can have it be greater than or less than some threshold. And for decision makers, when we're thinking about uncertainty, it's not just one piece of uncertainty that they're often kind of playing into their decision making or that they're communicating to their different core partners. So I just wanted to bring that into the conversation. Yeah, awesome. Thank you for helping.
Great, fantastic. Floor is open. This was meant to be, spark some thoughts. Yes, Kip.
Julie, I'm just wondering, do you have a mechanism or do you have some sense of how this has improved, or if they've made decisions on this and how it's improved their decision making?
I can, I almost want to show this other slide. It might take me a second, to pull it up. It will take me, so, I do. So a number of forecasters were talking about, let me see where I want to show this slide. How they have used it. Pull this one up and see if we can find the right quote somewhere in here, because we did some data collection through multiple rounds with them, but then also had them just came up with other ways of trying to tease out how they're using this kind of information. So this was for forecasters, a quote they were talking about in Sacramento. They volunteered this information. This is why I'm disclosing who they are. It wasn't something that had to be kept anonymous, where they were using some of this information for Caltrans to try to find out when snowfall rates would really pick up, so that they could, as you saw, again, adjust staffing accordingly during the time that the heaviest snow was going to be there. And I talked about how much, this ability to kind of resource accordingly is really important. And then every local weather forecast office has something called an area forecast discussion. And this one is from Cheyenne. And here they were just talking about using it to see kind of like what's the earliest onset for like some kind of winds of some threshold, and being able to kind of message this out, especially when you're thinking about in Cheyenne, they get a lot of high profile vehicles. So that in terms of thinking about issuing like high wind warnings.
Yeah, and so important, and something that's often missing for us is some metric on outcomes after we do
Yeah.
this.
Right now, stop and share.
Anybody else? Yes, Tyler.
Yeah, I guess my question is probably geared towards both here, but in my experience, when I'm trying to discuss potential impacts of hazardous weather in the environment, when I include uncertainties in my graphs or in my maps, often my users, they're not as in tune to HDIs and things like that, so they're not even thinking about credible intervals versus confidence intervals, and so they get a little concerned, and it almost is like information overload. And so what they'll really want is just like that mean line. They just kind of want to see what directionality that trend might be moving or might not be moving, or if we can consider a trend, or what, whatever it is. And what I've seen is, at least in the meteorological community, that's starting to leach its way into the actual publication realm, where I'm actually seeing less uncertainty discussed within the images that I'm reading in the literature. And as a scientist, sometimes it's a bit kind of concerning, because you're looking, I want to know what that uncertainty is as a way of making sense of that outcome. And I'm wondering if maybe our users, the way we interact is now finding a way to, make its way into more of that scientific space that we otherwise, wouldn't see.
Yeah, I think one of the challenges we're probably running into we have the computational tools to generate more kinds of uncertainty than ever. But our, I guess, cognitive ability to like process that is even harder. So I think sometimes I see users kind of faced with this onslaught, they kind of retreat toward what they're comfortable with, which tends to be a more deterministic outcome. That said, I think one of the issues with a lot of the uncertainty generation is that it's a lot of extra things to look at that may or may not actually change your decision. So like, and it's something we work through on some of these, like the UQ project, like our PTAG UQ project, like like 50 different ways to plot these multi-dimensional, like Dirichlet blobs. But most of them aren't really relevant for a decision maker if they're trying to figure out the timing of like when is the freezing rain going to start versus like when is it going to transition to snow. So we found like if there's, I guess when you're maybe making the presentations, like think about what might be what is the downstream decision that's being made, and what are the relevant uncertainties into that, and if there's some ways to synthesize that and show maybe it is just if they want to see the trend, why not just like show the trend, maybe you can get error bars on the trend or be like or have somebody say like, in this situation, yeah, we have confidence that the trend is up, or we don't really know what the trend's going to be, or the trend is so it's like simplifying things, but simplify with an aim toward the question, the user's needs and the question being asked. I have a couple more thoughts, but I'll let people talk and
Yeah,
also-
and Julie.
I think I just want to add on there and, from a Bayesian perspective, this is like another thing that I think is really beneficial from Bayesian analysis that is actually really hard in other contexts is how do we know the distribution or make inference on some function of a parameter or an outcome? And so while, you go into the geography literature, the social science literature, everyone has a paper on the best way to visualize uncertainty. And yet I've never seen one stick around, right? So I don't think that answer is solved, but I do think there are ways of massaging your outcomes to get it into this single number format. So instead of reporting the median trajectory, if you are in Bayesian land and you have all of your posteriors, right, you can count how many times, say, the rain falls above 2 inches, right? And then that is a single number. That is a parameter of your posterior. It's X, under this model, we have X probability that this will be above that number at that day. And that seems to be something when I work in kind of policy circles that people can digest a little bit more easily.
So I have
Yeah, go ahead, Julie, and then I've got Deborah and Joan, and then I saw somebody else, Patrick. Okay.
So just kind of 2 quick thoughts on this, Tyler. It's maybe a little bit different from what you asked, but these are probably 2 kind of provocative ideas. One other path I was trying to decide with these remarks is, we have been doing a bit of work with different kind of expert users to try to gauge their truly correct understanding of uncertainty information. And it's mixed. Right, so I've got data that says, we've been providing probability of exceedance graphics, probability of exceeding snowfall of different thresholds, right? And an expert user can read the graphic, but if we want them to kind of deduce information that's different from, like, if we give them the probability of exceeding 4 inches of snow, we want to know what they think the probability is of exceeding snowfall less than that, they can't figure out, right? But this does raise this question that I would say in the weather community have been grappling with is, when does that potential misunderstanding really potentially lead to poor decisions?
Right.
And that's a hard thing to measure, right? So I just wanted to say that. The other thing that I think kind of comes into this is, at least in certain domains and fields, I don't know if the priority or the goal should always be to create uncertainty information and not have another expert help interpret it, right? That happens so much. And I think we tend to have this normative view of we should have beautiful uncertainty information that we're putting out there, and these decision makers are going to use it. Now that it's not a sustainable approach to think about all members of the public. We can't support all of them. But say a forecaster can help an emergency manager understand how to interpret information. And oftentimes they do. The uncertainty is only synthesizing one piece of information, and they're making decisions about a lot of things. So that kind of human over the loop, involved in the loop, whatever the phrase is, I think maybe the goal isn't for that to always go away.
Let's loop back to something we were talking about at the beginning on Tuesday about risk, trustworthiness, our role in that space. Deborah.
So I have 2 comments, questions. So one is I'd like to any of you to see whether you like to comment on both known certainties as well as the unknown ones, especially in the context of this kind of work, and if we're making progress equally on both of them, and what we can, especially how we can think about that more amorphous unknown certainties, the unknowns. Yeah. And then another question just on some of the more, this relates to all, I heard bits of this in all of them, but whether increased to this gets a little bit to Beth's question, I think, when we think about the data integration, some of the reason that we express uncertainty on the socials, we have uncertainty on the social science side, is that our own tools of the trade are not really speaking to the data integration potential. We don't adequately sample drop prone regions, for example. I'll just give one simple example, or maybe, or we don't sample at the periodicity, the time stamps that are necessary, right? For decision-making or something, or even not decision-making, just changes that occur on a scale that's not decadal or annual or something like that. So I'm just wondering whether any of you have comments on whether increasing samples in certain ways or weighting schema to better understand how to use those samples would reduce uncertainties in the kinds of modeling efforts / translational activities to actual, like, it's always unfortunate when you have a group, you say, well, this group has gigantic error bars, so haha, do what you want with this information. So if you would like to comment on those two things, whoever would like to, I'd like to hear what you have to say.
Two big questions.
Yeah.
No.
And then engagement with, other national statistical data providers. So like, that's why I'm asking this question. Like, some people in this room, NOAA folks, please, like, go talk to the census. They produce some of these data. Go talk to the nationals, National Longitudinal Survey of Youth. If you want to know about how people change, like, or the health and retirement survey, that kind of thing.
Okay.
Sarah, Beth wants to add to that?
I'm sorry.
On everybody.
All right, okay.
Yeah, I can comment on the, I guess, sort of the unknown, like the known unknowns and things of that nature. I think some of the interest in the evidential modeling of my group's been working on and kind of this trying to like compartmentalize elator versus epistemic is because by quantifying them and knowing conditionally where they're high or low relative to each other, that can give you a sense of what intervention one might need if you want to tamp down a certain kind of uncertainty. So for epistemic, theoretically, you can either, there's like the two interventions, or you can add more data in that part of the space, or you can change the kind of model you're using. So you either maybe you need to make the model less flexible. Or maybe your model, or really think harder about how it's extrapolating, and account for that part of the uncertainty. For elator, like usually means adding more data doesn't help you because you're like, if it's already, 50 and you're not really gonna be able to, like, more samples won't help with that, but what can help is like, go get other information, go get a different data source that may have more correlation, if that is possible. I think one of the challenges coming from a predictive perspective of some of this stuff is there's things we can't, like, there isn't data available to grab it, there is no way to measure it, or doing so would require a much larger investment in surveillance of various sorts that isn't feasible. So I think in situations where we want to deal with the unknown unknowns, I don't think making our models better is the answer. I think it's thinking of what is the problem we're trying to prevent, and working on the resilient side of it. How can we be more robust to those negative outcomes, and thinking about that for different communities. The other thing I couldn't remember, we wanted to address on Tyler's question too, is also thinking about a lot of these decision-making processes are happening over time. As a modeler, sometimes it's tempting to kind of lump all those things together when you're fitting the model, but as it's rolling forward, the decision maker may not be making the decision once, they may be revisiting that decision multiple times in the lead up to an event, during and then after it. So thinking through one way where the uncertainty can add value is how is that uncertainty changing over that time period? Even if it's like a more qualitative way to describe it, that can be something that allows you to. You mentioned that is the trend going up and down, and sometimes people look at, is the forecast changing? And of course, some of that you have to be careful with is this forecast actually changing because the physical things are changing, or are you just seeing one sample out of all the possible samples, and you're just like seeing random walks and trying to infer too much from that. So,
Julie, Jess?
Yeah.
Go ahead, Elka. I think I agree largely with everything Jay said, especially the comment that like we're always having a trade-off between more data and it is such a computational efficiency. So like whether it's adding things and we're already dealing with massive data, maybe getting another sample every, where we're not is not actually going to help us. I think there's a lot that can be helpful to fill in missing data if you have any idea about how the missing time point is related to the time points next to it, right? So if we know that we expect that to be similar, that sounds like a Bayesian data augmentation problem to me, right? So that may not be that hard. The problem is if we don't know that there's any relationship, you're kind of screwed. The other thing I think, just from like a practical policy perspective, all of our, or a lot of our federal data, particularly our census data products, are they're often collected, even though we always look for different things, they're collected with specific policy or funding measures in mind, right? So the census happens every 10 years for a specific reason. Population estimates are generated every year so that community development block grants can go out. And the ACF provides us different information on this annual scale. But it would be nice to see, and we only get aggregate numbers with uncertainty. And I think it would be really nice to see the census have some sort of change of heart or change of process where, even if publicly available data doesn't change from the census, that governments, local governments in particular, could maybe get access to that data without so much uncertainty. So being able to access tract level information and not have to deal with 5 years of data if you know a disaster is coming and you need to plan or something like that is something I would really like to see, because the truth is the data is there. It's the data product that we're all getting access to that comes with the uncertainty. And I mean, I don't have the power to change that, but I would love to see that.
We all could, yeah, we could all do it together.
And I think the other thing I'll add to the second question, not the unknown unknowns, but I do think we need more data in certain situations, right? I mean, that comes back to what we were trying to do with our team this week, is to say, we know there are situations, we know that if you have a hurricane or an AR, some other weather event, it's dynamic, but so are people, right? That the risk is dynamic, their perceptions, their decisions are dynamic, and we didn't have those data. And even what we have is a nice first order step, but could imagine wanting to have that data on even finer timescales or for longer periods of time. And so I think there are certain questions, I think, that we're trying to address for which we don't have the data and the need to collect more of it. But then the other piece of this, I think, kind of coming back to so we've talked about the importance of open science and data use and reuse, is if we've designed those instruments and we've invested, thanks to NOAA funding, the funds to collect these data, we also want to make them available to the community so that they can benefit from it too, and just kind of considering the importance of data sharing increasingly with that.
I want to add one more comment. I totally forgot. Weighting, yes, very important. I think post-stratification is often really underused, even surprisingly in demography settings. So if you have population level data and your data isn't matching up with that population on some categorical variable, there are reweighting schemes that can even propagate uncertainty in those solutions. And that can be really, really fundamental. And you're going to be getting biased results if you don't do it.
Sarah, may I add one other?
I think I had like several people that I called.
Okay, go for it.
So
I'll come back.
was it Joan, and then Patrick, and then somebody else? Kip? No.
I do have a question then.
Joan.
I'll be brief because that was a reaction to the earlier conversation, about what was compelling, I think, for some of the examples you all gave was really useful information in the uncertainty that was very clear. Like, we need to be ready for the rainfall 3 hours earlier. I think often a lot of us stick uncertainty estimates and we're not. I like Julie's comment about like, we need help interpreting them, but we're not really interpreting them in our papers even usually. And actually they're more confusing. And so doing more hand holding in terms of why these are useful, what information people should take home from it in the way that we do for, the mean or median point estimate would be really important. And that it also kind of comes back to Sarah mentioned the trustworthiness thing. I think people are also very scared. Like in my work, I'm studying sometimes the fossil fuel industry, and it's like another thing to attack in a model if I'm trying to provide a range of estimates. It's like, oh, I don't even know what's really happening. And so it comes back to like the trustworthiness of science and how we do this safely, which then like goes back to STEM education and people being able to understand what we're saying. So yeah, it's a deeply embedded problem. And I do feel like I've been at conferences like a decade ago where we basically had this conversation, and it's unfortunate that like we're still, I don't know what the plan is, but I think having the useful estimates that provide real tangible information is like definitely like a really great first step.
And another thing that comes to mind that I thought about earlier, and I just want to mention, for those of you who are ever using Bayesian models and maybe even some machine learning, like if you're outside of the realm of basic frequentist statistics and confidence intervals, we all learned those first, right? Every stats class, we learned how to make a confidence interval, even if we don't do that anymore. And those are symmetric. And I think that people tend to assume any other kind of interval is also symmetric because that's what we're taught. And so I am a huge advocate of visualizing your uncertainty over putting it in a paper, putting it in the text, because it matters if that distribution is skewed, it matters if it's symmetric, it doesn't really matter what the endpoints are.
Nice. Patrick.
So I had a related question, was more about our responsibility in communicating uncertainty to decision makers, especially in contexts where there are multiple forms of uncertainty that are all high, like you said. I think DJ was screwed kind of go that stop us from researching. And what I would say are policy actors, so more than just like the specific decision makers, are responsive to what they read, whether it's in like actual research journal outlets or the New York Times. Right, so how can we responsibly communicate uncertainty in those sorts of instances where in California over the next 50 years, we have reason to believe it's going to get both drier and wetter from precipitation models, and we have to make choices about where to place new infrastructures, right?
Right.
Transportation corridors.
Or start to help the people that are, the places that are most vulnerable to those, yeah.
Yeah, I think it's a tricky issue. One thing I've been trying to lean more on, and some of this has come out of some of my other collaborations, is especially why I made the plot with the kind of the different, the sensible heat flux uncertainty regimes is it can help a lot with when communicating uncertainty to kind of know what are the knobs that are being that can be tuned to lead to the different uncertainty outcomes. So they're like yeah, there's California, like 50% of the models are saying wetter or drier. Like what is different about them? And it's not just in like that context, but in any of our modeling contexts, I think we should be more cognizant of having the sensitivity or inputs to go along with that uncertainty. It's too easy. Like I've fallen prey to this. My team has fallen prey to this, and trying to reorient ourselves. I don't want to speak for anyone else beyond that. But something I've seen is like, yeah, we have all these outputs, but then we didn't have the inputs to go along with it. So it's like, oh, that's an interesting number, and interesting. Like is that uncertainty overly wide, overly small? Doesn't make sense in the context of those, whatever regime you're in for that decision maker, because that can also help. So if you can make that linkage, then you can help. You're making effectively the causal narrative, and I think the tricky part is it a linear one? Is it a non-linear one where there's like feedback effects? And that's where it gets a little bit messier, and where maybe interactive visualizations can be useful. So like one of the things we're working on with the P-type project is actually having a kind of interactive viewer, sort of like what Julia showed, but then we have our MLP type model with the sounding, and you can click on a point and then drag the temperature profile or the moisture profile of the sounding over, and you can see it'll rerun the ML model with that new sounding and see how it changed. So now the forecaster or whoever the user is can go do mess around with that, and we're still grounded by what the main forecast is, but then they can explore what if the actual temperature is 2 degrees warmer? How does that change the scenario? What if it's a little bit drier aloft? Sometimes that I didn't even know this until we started playing with the interactive viewer, but making it drier aloft increases the probability of freezing rain over sleep. So that's very useful information. You may not be able to put that into your summary uncertainty.
Always so many. Beth, do you have something quick to comment? Because others, go ahead.
Yeah, no,
You were next.
talk about it.
Yeah, Catherine, and then I saw Samir and Kim. Yeah.
Yeah, really grateful and enjoying this conversation. What's coming up for me is uncertainty is part of this entire enterprise. And all of the stopping points along the way. And earlier this week, folks were talking about, the advantages of bringing in collaborators who exist in the risk perception world. As I think about the different actors that we're discussing today, but then also from the sociological and social demographic side, there are in fact the people who, we're very interested in, and the uncertainty that that we people are constantly confronting, and the decisions that we're making within these uncertain contexts. And so I understand we're talking about the data generation, the data analysis, and the data delivery, and the interpretation of the data. And yet there's this other piece that I think is really, really important, because that we're all also operating under these contexts of uncertainty and responding differently depending on a number of factors.
Mhm.
So it's not so much a specific question, but something that I've been hearing here and there throughout the week, and I'm curious to just open it up for conversation perhaps here or elsewhere, but it's
Yeah,
like
let's-
this big
yeah.
part of this.
Definitely Julie's wheelhouse
Yeah.
and,
Well, I think
and
that's-
Anne. But, yeah, the connection between risk, true risks, risk perception, risk preferences. Yeah.
I'd also just say that,
Yeah.
that, I mean, uncertainty is inherent in risk, right? Like risk, it comes with uncertainty, otherwise it wouldn't be risky, like you would know some piece of it, right? So when you think about definitions of risk, the uncertainty is so embedded in that. But I think one of the things that I was thinking about also when Patrick raised this question that you're talking about is we also have to recognize that not making a decision is a decision, right? And I think, Patrick, the example you were giving is a really long time scales. I work on much shorter time scales, but there is always the opportunity to have new information, and sometimes like communicating to decision makers when new information will come out. And that way we can see if uncertainty is reduced to help better facilitate a decision. So kind of this comes back to a point DJ made a few minutes ago. It's very dynamic. Like we tend to think about these things cross-sectionally at a moment in time, but people are making decisions, at very, very short timescales and over longer timescales, and understanding kind of when they need to make critical decisions. Like, are there critical points in time by which they need to decide we're going to evacuate or not, right? But if we haven't reached that point yet, then we can wait for new information, and maybe some kinds of uncertainties get reduced. And so I love that you're bringing in the decision space and risk assessment and decision-making into all of this. And then also recognizing that's a very dynamic process in conjunction with the dynamic uncertainties.
I also want to add one thing to that, which is that, and this also goes to Patrick's question. Yes, all local governments need a number and they need to make decisions in this space. But when we're thinking about the models, we're usually not modeling just one space, right? And so there are going to be places, even in the presence of mass uncertainty, where we are not very uncertain. And I think that's a big part of us as scientists in communicating to our stakeholders, other places, letting them know, like, this is a sure thing. This is a sure thing. Here's where it's muddy, right? And that also is decreasing uncertainty in our decision making, whittling down those decisions to say, the model here says it has no idea, and that might mean we have no data and I really can't help you and you need to rely on your expertise as a policymaker, or it might mean we're right on the line, right? And that's the kind of stuff that we can help, but I think parsing out those, I think we're rarely in a place with temporal or spatial data where the uncertainty is equally shared across space or time.
Really good point. Do you want to, I can see you just saying you want to jump in, but then I'm gonna get to Samir.
Oh, okay. Well, I wanted to, pick up a bullet point that Jess had on her first slide, which is that, there's uncertainty and there's bias. And one of the things that Deborah was saying about, the problem with samples is that, they're spatially sparse. And so when we're trying to make these population and environment connections, we have a lot more uncertainty in the population data because of that sparsity in our samples. But increasingly, we're using administrative data because it's more spatially complete. And then what you're getting is lower uncertainty, at least in a spatial way, but more bias because who's in that administrative data. It systematically excludes certain people. And so, I think that as we make this trade-off, we need to also, when we think about uncertainty, as we gain certainty, we might also be gaining bias, and we need tools for dealing with that.
So Samir, you've been very patient.
Oh, yeah. It's
Thank
still,
you.
so this won't be a fully formed question. It's something that's just in my head right now, and kind of as the social scientist in me, this is where this question is coming from. So, I think when I think about uncertainty, in the social sciences world, there's a risk of treating uncertainty when we think about things like climate or weather, when we develop a shared understanding of what those risks or impacts are. So for instance, what I mean by that is there might be a specific way of understanding what climate change is. And then we're building uncertainty estimations around precipitation or so forth. I think like what happens when we don't actually have a shared understanding of what climate change is or what weather extreme events are. So things that I've heard are, in some of our field research are, which are expressions of uncertainty are what happens if my well is dry next year? Or what happens if there's this subtle change in precipitation that doesn't register as an extreme event, but that totally decimates my crops? So what I'm kind of getting at is, how do we actually treat uncertainty when we have radically different understandings of not just kind of interval ranges, but fundamental experiences of climate
Meaningfulness
impacts?
of an event, yeah.
Yeah, so it's a difficult question, but I'm kind of, and I think it speaks strongly to this idea of data integration of data as an artifact, but also not just social impacts, but socially lived experiences of those impacts.
This is a really oversimplification of what you just said, Samir, but I love it. And I think one of the simple ways I think about it is, because we talk about this a lot in our community, it's uncertainty associated with a hazard and then with the impact of that hazard, right? And that part is, we have a hard time over here. We really have a hard time over here because those impacts are so heterogeneous. We don't always know what matters. We don't have good data on a lot of that, like what you were talking about, if your well goes dry, well, who has that data, right? And you're trying to link that uncertainty with this uncertainty over here. So again, an oversimplification, but at least spinning on them those ways, I think starts to get at the places where uncertainty manifests, for lack of a better word.
What is it? Yeah, just, I could talk
This is absolutely a lazy answer coming from a statistician, but I also firmly believe it, that this is where qualitative, like mixed methods research matters so much, because that data on wells doesn't exist. And even if it did, all of the modeling we're talking about is really population level processes, right? We're thinking in aggregate, we're thinking about a government trying to respond to a disaster or prepare for it. When we're talking about the well, that person is thinking about them and their family, right? And our data is not thinking about individuals in that way. And I think the only way we can really do right by data that comes at that individual data level is through qualitative work.
Can I have one follow-up?
You should say what your fieldwork is anyway.
Yeah. So it's that, I'm happy to say more about that, but one of the papers that I'm thinking about is from someone named Mara Goldman at Boulder Geography. And she has this great paper where she's talking about drought, how drought is experienced by Maasai people in Kenya and Tanzania. And it's kind of how drought is very relational. So it might be when the pasture turns yellow, or when certain availabilities of water were, people might not allow access to common property areas. And for Maasai, that is the consideration of a climate impact. Whereas in many places around the world, and this kind of comes back to my work around issues of drought, is we're seeing this almost technification of how we measure drought, right? And when we think about uncertainty, it's built into, how do we think about uncertainty in a composite index of soil moisture or hydrology or departures in precipitation? Whereas people are thinking about drought in fundamentally, radically different ways of best links to their fundamental experience. So I think that's where the question actually.
That's really thoughtful. Yeah. Alexis has it. I know we're all getting hungry. We've gone over time. Alexis.
So I've heard the uncertainty in the denominator. I think to what Beth was mentioned is also another thing that emerges now and has emerged in my work is the uncertainty in the numerator. Also, a lot of times these administrative records, they take a long time to be updated, and we saw it with the COVID-19, people were analyzing incomplete data and making assumptions about mortality going down in certain specific cases. And so I guess my question would be, I don't know, we're short on time, but how have you approached it in any way, this type of uncertainty in more than one way and within your models? If at any time.
If you're speaking about people in general
Yeah.
and missing parts of your ideal population, then I think post-stratification is like the simplest statistical way forward. You know what should be there, and if there's a few of those people, you're relating their responses. I also think this is a point where like record linkage and trying to bring in multiple types of data, which is often a huge pain, but that's often the only real solution there when there's huge systemic bias.
Thanks.
Yeah, one thing that, like, I've seen this kind of issue come up on with some of the crap, like weather reports, so so your storm, like the storm events database. There are some evaluations that are done like kind of real time where you wanna run your tornado or hail model and then see the next day how well did it do. The problem is it often takes more than a day for all the reports to come in. So we're making evaluations against, we're seeing evaluations be made against reports that then have implications on what product is adopted, based off of incomplete data, but in some cases, this isn't being accounted for and should be to some degree, but because like so much is people are still people, and it kind of gets into this the qualitative evaluation and definitions I feel like they don't just show up in like some random within a population that is say a non-expert population or but they're throughout science, and I don't know what the solution is to some of this because it's people are people, and we're gonna make these kinds of, we're gonna try to make the best decision made with the information available at the time. So I can't say I have a solution for this. but-
Okay, can I comment on that?
Yeah.
My comment was related to that and something you said earlier, DJ, about how much, what's the cognitive load of holding all of this information? I'm hearing from people, we don't even have enough uncertainty information, even with all we have, we need more of it. So I think we have to think about decision-making also as a long duration event, and risk perception is not a static thing. If someone has been up 72 hours working on a hurricane, their cognitive load is gonna be lower than usual, and their perception is gonna be different than usual. So I think that there is a real role here for AI systems to provide objective measures and interpret, they don't have the cognitive load problem that humans have. They can look at all this information at once. So I hope we can work together to build those.
Yeah, I will say that.
As a co-pilot, right?
Yeah, there's a definite benefit to that. I think the weakness with a lot of the AI and computational systems is they are very brittle in what kinds of information they bring in. And while the LLMs are a little bit better about this, they are still very much reliant on text and images and the biases associated with that. So I think there's still a lot of room for the human expert to be flexible and be able to synthesize different sources of information. And especially on the qualitative side and the higher level patterns. And so I think we'll make progress from a computational perspective by getting at some of these things. I have to work on some of this. I still think there's always going to be this inherent trade-off where the humans are always going to be more flexible and should be a part of the process of the result.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so we're gonna break for lunch, but before you break, let me give you some highlights about the afternoon. So we're gonna have, first of all, thank you. Thank you. Really wonderfully complimentary set of presentations and really thank you to all of you for asking and thinking and commenting in really thoughtful ways too. 1:30 back here, we have demographiers, don't forget, and flame to flame. And then we'll have a break and then we'll do an evaluation of this Hack Week. And then we have another set of presentations which is going to be Demos and disaster demography. And then wonderfully, we have Jonathan Moat hosting a closing discussion about what we've accomplished this week. So, great. So stick around, have some lunch, you continue to get well fed. And of course, we have Mama Molina's tonight, so yeah. Okay, thank you. I was